God of Trash, Cultivation LitRPG, From Trash Tier to the Ultimate Trash. Book 4 complete. By noct Chapter 271 to 290. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel, get early access to video on Patreon. Night fell. Mages remained out, as beings without much need for sleep, but the composition of the streets changed. Giggling and raucous cries came from the taverns and pleasure houses. Drunks staggered openly around the red light district. Those who weren't out for pleasure moved quickly, their heads down and a furtive energy about their motions. They carried weapons prominently. Some glared around, daring anyone to come and test their steel. Others hurried along, hand resting on their weapons, ready to use them for self-defense but not ready to test them on anyone. Almost no one wore finery anymore, outside of the red light districts, that is. No one was foolish enough to tempt fate. Rhys strolled along, dressed just as he'd been during the day. He now stood out as an average-looking person, neither dressed up for fun or dressed down for murder. He hummed to himself, arms behind his head, not clutching any weapon in particular. A few of the hard-eyed individuals glanced his way, but when he met their gaze with a placid disinterest, most of them turned away again. He was either mad or powerful, and they weren't interested in risking their lives to find out. If he was mad, it wouldn't be worth it, and if he was powerful, then they'd handed their necks over on a silver platter to a predator bigger than them. None of them particularly frightened Rhys. They really weren't that strong, and he wasn't interested in crushing noobs. He was smurfing right now, pretending to be a lower rank than he was, but he wasn't doing it for pleasure, but instead for business. He wouldn't enjoy handing noobs their asses the way a true smurf would. That's right. This is business smurfing, Rhys thought, and had to repress a smile. What a dumb way to express what he was doing, but it wasn't like he was wrong. Sometimes, one had to hide their strength for good reason, instead of no reason at all. He wound closer to the inverted triangle. The neighborhoods closest to it were walled off and closed in by a powerful barrier. Another barrier coated the inverted pyramid itself like a second skin, so close it almost appeared to be part of the walls. It wasn't going to be easy to get inside without anyone noticing. Rhys pinched his chin. Of course, there was always the option of going loud, but, although he knew they had fake lira, he didn't know for sure that they didn't have real lira, and if they decided to roundabout and hold Mouse hostage, well, he wasn't confident that he could call their bluff and keep her alive, and he didn't want to lose her. And of course, there was always the matter of Bast, whom they could also use as a hostage, and the yet more troublesome issue of the Sword Saint. He sighed, then caught sight of a well-dressed couple heading into the walled-off district in their party best. He raised his brows thoughtfully. There was still the option of executing part of his and Soma's plan. He wouldn't have control of the setting anymore, and he wouldn't have any hidden allies whose marks had been edited without Virgil's awareness, but it could still take a shot at stealth removing the Sword Saint's mark. It was better than facing him in open battle and trying to remove it there. At least at a party, the Sword Saint might not immediately react with violence if someone got a little touchy. Of course, this all assumed that the Sword Saint was not willfully under Virgil. If he was, and Rhys removed his mark, only for it to turn out that he'd truly pledged his loyalty the way that other braindead guy had, then Rhys would be the one in big trouble, in a lot of ways. Reporting to Virgil, getting caught by the Sword Saint, hell, his immediate future was in question in that case. But even so, it was worth a shot. Of course, he didn't have an invite, nor did he have party clothes, nor did he even know if the Sword Saint attended parties. That was going to be the part Soma controlled, including having the social pull to successfully invite the Sword Saint. Without Soma, he'd have to do it the hard way. And that meant it was time for his favorite thing, a quick trip to the garbage heap. Mixed in with those in avant-garde fashion and dressed in their party best were the less fortunate. The sick, the disadvantaged, mages whose paths had gone sour, or who had never had a chance to make it, or who'd become addicted to some drug or another. Gods knew it was easy to get your hands on drugs in a world where alchemists hawked magic potions on every street corner, and had crashed out of life. They huddled in corners or picked trash on the backstreets, hunched and filthy, holding out their hands or their hat for coin. No one noticed when one more filthy, rag-wearing mage joined their number, slumped over near the entrance to the pleasure district. Like all the rest, he reeked of alcohol and spices and human body odor and trash, and his clothes were more filthy rags than proper gear. Passing drunkards kicked him, and all he offered was a dull grunt. Soft-hearted nobles tossed him a coin or two, only to find him in the same spot, drinking away their contributions the next day. And so a few weeks passed. The drunk blended in, no more than another of the world's losers, another lost soul who would never progress on their journey through midgehood. He languished on the corner, and he listened. Tidbits of conversations. Snippets of data. The city's nobles walked right past him without so much as glancing down, as if he was an object, and as an object, he blended perfectly in. There was no need to watch what one said around an object, and so, they didn't. The parties, the problems, whose husband was messing around with whose wife, who was maybe probably totally copying whose technique, who was jealous of who. Honestly, it makes me wonder why people pay for cable TV. I've got more than enough soap opera right here, Rhys thought, peeking out from under his filthy bangs. He'd spent long enough on the corner. It was time to make his move. It was late, and the moon was dark. A drunk man staggered out of the pleasure district, humming a tune to himself. Hey, pay your tab, a bartender shouted, poking his head out of his bar. The man waved. I'll pay it tomorrow. That's what you said last week. Tomorrow, tomorrow. The bartender grimaced. You're lucky the owner's afraid of your family, you worthless piece of shit. The man hummed louder, deliberately ignoring him. He wobbled along, out of the pleasure district, and passed by the drunk, the same drunk he'd passed a million times before. He looked down, then stopped and walked back. His shadow fell over the man. Why, you know what's the difference between me and you? He asked the homeless man, swaying in place. Illuminate me, Rhys replied. I'm rich. Ha, ha ha, the man turned and stumbled off again. There's a second difference, too. The man turned back, then staggered a step away. Rhys loomed over him, taller than him and suddenly emanating a higher-tier aura. The man's eyes widened. I'm alive. Rhys touched the man's neck. Impurities spread through the man's body, corrupting him faster than he could so much as scream. Rhys instantly sucked the man into his core, then jogged ahead through the town, drawing out a small gemstone-studded amulet as he ran. He swapped out his current filthy outfit for Norton's robes, yanked from the trash star seconds before they incinerated, and pulled the liquor bottle he'd been drinking for several weeks now out of his storage ring, then doused himself in alcohol so that the scent would drown his musk. He turned a sharp corner and rushed down an alleyway, coming to the man's house. The man's name had been Norton Tunk. He was a cheater and a drunk, whose wife cried alone every night and whose family had all but publicly disowned him. In other words, trash. But noble trash was still noble, and so, as social season came around, he was sent the usual obligatory invites, even if the inviters would rather he wouldn't come, and could almost count on his absence, as Rhys had overheard, since he was such a drunk he'd forget to come or drink too much and be unable to stagger to the party. But Rhys had a real funny feeling that Norton Tunk was about to turn a real sharp corner in his life, clean up his act, and attend a few parties. Especially parties with Ernesto, Bast, the Sword Saint, and, if he was lucky and cleaned up his act so much he started being sincerely invited, Virgil himself. The amulet opened the barrier around the house. The doors inside weren't locked, why would they be? Rhys pushed the front door open and quickly scanned the room with his mana, then stumbled up the stairs at the fastest drunken stumble he'd ever managed, beelining for the bath. Look who bothered to come home. Rhys froze. The speaker, Norton's wife, presumably, was behind him, but he didn't turn. Until he hit the bath, he still looked like an NPC, and Norton was many things, but an NPC was not one of them. He had a very distinctive face and silhouette, and despite his unfortunate personality, love of drink, and tendency to be unfaithful to his partners, he was quite handsome. Not as hot as Soma, but hotter than Rhys's own face. Proof, probably, that the gods rewarded the wicked just as much as the pure. There are evil gods, in this world. After all, anyone can attain godhood if they become powerful enough. Perhaps they pick favorites. His wife coughed, and Rhys jolted. Right, I need to say something. He racked his brains, trying to remember what she'd said, but it had gone right in one ear and out the other. He had no idea. Wait, but Norton would be the same. Rhys waved dismissively and mumbled something drunkenly, staggering up the stairs with one hand firmly on the banister. His wife huffed. I ought to kick you out. See how you like living on the street with the rest of the drunks. Rhys shook his head. I just got off the street. This is my route out of that situation. Don't send me back out there. Another sigh. The stairs creaked behind him. Do you need help getting to the bedroom? I won't have you puking on the stairs again. I'm goo, Rhys slurred, while suddenly coordinating his steps a lot more. If she got too close, she'd doubtlessly realize he wasn't Norton. He hadn't disguised himself yet, and he didn't want to have to cosplay both Norton and Norton's wife. Logistics aside, it sounded exhausting to have to play two people simultaneously. Abruptly, Norton's wife gagged. What is that smell? Did you fall in the sewers? Gods. It's not that bad, Rhys thought, then sniffed himself. His brows shot up. Okay, maybe it is that bad. I'm going to shower. Shower. Be bath, Rhys quickly stammered. Shit, am I drunk? What a horrible time to forget my time period. She harumphed and descended the stairs. As she vanished off into another room, she shouted back, and don't come into the main bedroom tonight. Don't worry, I wasn't planning on it. Rhys hurried up the stairs and toward the bath. One quick dip in the bath later, Rhys assumed Norton's identity, then drained the tub, got back in, scrubbed himself, drained the tub again, scrubbed himself again, applying lots of soap and hot water every round until he smelled like soap and roses even when he surged mana to his nose. There was a lingering waft of garbage mixed in, but there was nothing he could do about that. That came from within, and it was a scent he would probably never be free of. Still, it wasn't that bad, and the soap and roses mostly repressed it. He stored his usual clothes, and Norton's previous outfit, in his storage ring, then dressed himself in some nice, comfortable, beautiful robes he found hanging in the man's closet. He didn't really know what to do with himself until daytime. It seemed it was fashionable for noble mages to sleep during the night, and accordingly, there was a sumptuous bed waiting for him in the room next to the bathroom. It might not be the main bedroom, but it was plenty fancy for Rhys. He sat down on the bed, bouncing a bit on the mattress. Reaching out, he felt the softness of the comforter and the plushness of the pillow. Come to think of it, even when he'd slept, he hadn't slept on beds, not since, I think, Purple Dawn Academy. And I didn't use that bed that much. Especially after Lyra rained all over it. He considered for another few seconds, then shrugged to himself. If he was going to kill a nobleman, assume his identity, and take on everything that came with it, then he might as well enjoy his assumed life of luxury. Rhys undressed to his underrobes and climbed under the covers into fresh silken sheets. He let out a sigh of contentment and wiggled in, getting nice and cozy, then shut his eyes. Ah, a quick snooze. Rhys jerked awake when he sensed a mana signature hovering over him. He slapped a hand to his chest, a split second from summoning the filth sword, when his brain finally caught up with his eyes. Norton's wife. That's Norton's wife. I'm not in danger. She harumphed. Lily, I think her name is. So surprised to see your own wife when you wake up, you fucking womanizing scum. Never mind, I am in danger. Rhys laughed nervously, then cut it off sharply when Lily's expression darkened further. I've decided. It's time to turn over a new leaf. No more womanizing. No more drinking. I'm on the straight and narrow from here on out. Oh, really? Lily's voice dripped with sarcasm, so full of venom Rhys almost felt as though he could absorb it. And what made you come to this revelation? Rhys racked his brains. I nearly died last night. I bumped into someone I shouldn't have and he almost took my head. I'm lucky to be alive. I can't do this any longer. Ruin my life like this. Lily frowned, then pressed a hand to his brow. You don't have a fever. Okay, fair. Addicts don't just cold turkey quit one day on a whim. And I'm not really talking like Norton, either. He was a stuck-up asshat who thought he was better than everyone, but I'm not going to get many invites with that persona, so it's time for Norton to find religion and reevaluate his whole life, or whatever the equivalent of that is in this world. Have an epiphany. Reach enlightenment. She stepped back and crossed her arms while Rhys was thinking, then harumphed. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were an imposter. A familiar siren SFX played in Rhys's head. Haha, I'm not Seuss, don't vote me out. Vote red is Baka Sussy. Rhys chuckled. Who would want to take my place? A loser like you. Gods only know, Lily scoffed, rolling her eyes. Rhys laughed along, though carefully injected a bitter note in his voice. He eyed Lily. When he was being a sussy baka, back when he played social deduction games, he'd had a friend, his female friend, to be precise, who could out him from just hearing his voice. Apparently, he used a subtly different tone when he was the baddie. Kindly, she'd either played along and pretended not to know, or told him to come kill her at the start of the round when she knew it was him. That didn't do him any good here, of course. Lily wasn't going to hide in a back office and tell him on VC, if you kill me here, no one will find the body. No, she'd be playing for her life, while he was stuck doing a shoddy impression of her husband from his weeks or so of observation as the man walked by him on the street, more often drunk than not. Between the two of them, Lily had the advantage. He just had to hope that this was the classic romance novel living together but apart situation, and that she didn't actually know Norton as well as a wife should know her husband. Otherwise, he'd be stuck playing his main account and a sock puppet in the same session, so to speak. That could be fun, but 1, it totally ruined the point of social deduction games, and 2, he was pretty sure it wasn't fun in real life. Still, Norton spent most of his life drunk, high, or both, from what I could tell. Maybe Lily never met sober Norton, or spent so little time around him that he's basically a stranger. It was basically his only hope at this point, or else he'd be picking up corpse puppeteering skills alongside all the other questionably moral stuff he could do. Sure, he wasn't AA+ student when it came to morality, more of a D's get degrees type, but he was pretty sure killing a woman then puppeteering her dead body to parties would flunk him out of morality. That was more than just casually fucked up, that was major league, special time, serial killer, slasher film fucked up. No, trying to double time and cosplay as both halves of the happy couple is probably my better bet, though even he hadn't worked out what would happen when they were introduced at a fancy dinner, and both husband and wife had to descend the sweeping grand staircase together. Maybe a hybrid approach, with a little bit of corpse puppeteering mixed in with the more acceptable crossplay. Or you don't plan to kill this woman, win the social deduction game, and never encounter this problem in the first place, a loud voice at the front of his mind argued. It wasn't like he was certain to fail, either. He'd been pretty good at mixing in among others. His KDR was definitely in the positives in that game, and that was saying something. He just had to face reality and admit that bluffing some strangers who believed self-reporting was a low percentage play was different from bluffing a wife that he was her husband who'd suddenly turned a new leaf out of the blue and decided to stop being a drunken piece of shit. He realized, abruptly, that she'd been saying something when there was suddenly silence in the bedroom. Rhys stared at her, glassy-eyed, and hoped she'd give him a hint. "I'm sorry, I have no idea what you just said. I was too busy thinking about Amogus." Instead, Lily rolled her eyes. "Gods. As if you'd actually change. Find me when you're ready to listen." She tossed her hair and stomped out, slamming the door behind her. Alone in the bedroom, Rhys pumped his fist silently. Hell yeah, beat the QTE. Sure, ignoring women was bad, but since he was cosplaying Norton, and Norton was a piece of shit, he'd succeeded by doing the wrong thing. It was kind of dangerous, honestly. He'd learn bad habits if he kept pretending to be Norton so successfully. But, I am the Norton who turned over a new leaf and reevaluated his life, so it's time to be a good husband. Rhys hopped to his feet with a smile, full of energy, then paused. But how? He hadn't had a wife in his world. Hell, even a girlfriend was asking too much of him. What did you do to make a partner happy? The only things that came to his mind were rom-coms, the absolute garbage Hallmark movies his mother had loved, and Arrow manga, though he was pretty sure that last one was the worst example to follow. Even an idiot at love like him realized hentai wasn't in touch with reality, let alone something to base a relationship off of. Most girls wouldn't be happy if you shot. Ahem. Anyways, there were some simple things he could do to clean up Norton's act that were shy of suddenly transforming into the perfect husband the way the leads in shitty romances always seem to. Like, for example, get dressed, brush his hair, and generally clean himself up. He'd copied Norton's appearance exactly, and that included some grungy stubble. At a certain realm, mages stopped growing hair unless they willed it, including facial hair, so that one had been a real conscious effort on Norton's part. What for, Rhys couldn't say, maybe to piss off Lily. Or maybe a low tier 2 like Norton didn't have full control of that yet. Whatever the case, it needed to go. It looked bad, and it was an easy enough part of him to clean up. Rhys headed back into the bathroom and paused at the mirror, then paused, stymied once more. Norton didn't have a razor. He stared at himself for a few long seconds, then rolled his eyes. He was a mage. What did he need a razor for? He drew a small knife from his storage ring and quickly sliced them off just for effect, then used his mana to expunge the rest of the facial hair. He turned his face left and right, raising his brows, and nodded. Yep, Norton was attractive. It was probably the only reason the idiot man was still alive. He remembered telling his cats in frustration many times that it was a good thing they were so cute. He'd been joking, but mages were less patient than he was, and, he had to admit, people were way less cute than cats. If not for his family and face, he was pretty sure Norton wouldn't have made it to this stage of his life. He hadn't gathered too much about the Tunk family, except that they were powerful, quiet old money, who did quiet luxury with the slow determination of a family with several members in the high hundreds to low thousands of years in lifespan. Norton was the black sheep of the family, the disappointment, and even then, he was quiet compared to some of the flashier, new money types. He was the perfect target for Rhys because of that, just well enough known without being instantly recognizable to many, but it did mean he had to walk a narrow line. His path wasn't cosplay and social deception, as much as he'd probably enjoy that. If he ended up in front of any of Norton's family, there was a good shot they'd see through him far faster than his half-abandoned wife. And with the depth of money and experience invested in Norton's family, he was sure to have a few grandmasters in his grandparents or parents who could wipe the floor with Rhys, even at tier 4. Rhys chuckled to himself. Yeah, easy. Just avoid all his family, who I know very little about, fool his wife, and steal his life. He only needed to survive a few weeks. A few weeks, and he could put this all behind him. Why do I feel like I can hear the shark movie theme playing already? Rhys got dressed and went downstairs. He scanned the building with his mana senses before he descended, so he knew Lily wasn't around. The only person in the house aside from him was a young new maid who Norton had just hired, whom Lily hated, obviously. The maid glanced at him as he descended the stairs and tucked her hair behind her ear, then licked her lips. Straightening his robes, Rhys ignored her. He was the Norton who'd turned over a new leaf, and he was not going to sleep with the maid anymore. He had to get on the wife's good side. Also, the maid wasn't really his type. She kind of looked like a girl who'd bullied him in his first life, and he still had trauma toward that kind of woman, blonde and conventionally attractive, basically. It wasn't her fault, but it did mean he found it easy to ignore her advances. From now on, I'm a good person who loves his fake wife and takes care of his household. He paused for a second, considering his objectives. If he was going to be a good person, how did he spend his day? Studying and cultivating, focusing on the next stages of his magehood. I do have that bottleneck, he considered, nodding slowly. It wasn't like he couldn't use a little time to himself to just think about things and figure out, 1, what was stopping him, and 2, how to break through that thing. Both he and Norton would benefit from a little hard work and thinking power, so why not? Rhys looked around. He was in the dining area right now. Around the corner, there was a kitchen, and beyond that, a formal sitting area that gave off the same exact vibes as his mom's special parlor with its special white furniture that he wasn't supposed to touch. He extended his mana senses, continuing to scan the rooms. There was a banquet room, though no ballroom. The estate wasn't large enough for it, and God's knew Norton's family didn't want him entertaining anyone. There was a study, but based on the lighting and tastefully placed houseplants, that didn't belong to Norton, a smoking room that reeked of impurities even from where he stood, and a few bedrooms and baths on the second floor. The roof was organized into a small garden, and there was a second, small garden out the rear of the house. The smoking room would be great, Rhys thought, then had to clamp down on his enthusiasm. The smoking room was probably where Norton spent most of his time already. He couldn't turn over a new leaf hidden away in that musty old place, as much as he'd like that. He gave it a longing look through the walls of the house and sighed. Honestly, he didn't even want to absorb the impurities, because it was such a nice impure room in the middle of an entire city full of mages who loved cleanliness and purity. Maybe I'll sneak down here after dark and hang out in the smoking room. Excuse me, sir. Would you like breakfast? Rhys startled back to reality to find that conventionally attractive blonde face very close to his. He jerked back, hitting his head on the reinforced mage-built wall, then bent forward, clutching his head. Ow, regrets. Sir. Yes. Breakfast would be nice, Rhys said on reflex. He thought for a second, then snorted. As if he needed to think. Breakfast was delicious, and mage food was delicious and great for leveling up. He could kill 2 birds with 1 stone with a delicious breakfast. The maid nodded. She walked to the table and pulled back the seat at the head of the table, and Rhys sat down. She went to tuck his napkin in, but Rhys held up his hand. I can do that myself. She raised her brows, but nodded and retreated. There was some clattering in the kitchen, and some time passed. Rhys, who had nothing to do and nowhere to be, simply meditated for a bit, extending his mana senses to get a feel for all the households around him. At this time of day, the houses themselves were mostly empty, which meant his prods went unnoticed. Off to the right, his mana senses brushed against another person's, and he instantly retreated. Whoever that was, he didn't want them noticing him in particular. His mana signature wasn't identical to Norton's, though it would take someone very familiar with Norton to notice. His neighbor might qualify as very familiar, but with a momentary brush like that, they'd simply take it as a curious passerby. Both the houses to either side of him were sumptuous, so much nicer than this house that Rhys slowly realized that Norton was being punished, being made to live in this grand manner. Of all the houses he could sense, it was the smallest, and had the fewest rooms, the most standard layout, and the least impressive gardens. Compared to anything Rhys had ever lived in, it was incredibly lavish, with fine fixtures that outshone even the finest his original world had to offer, but clearly, for mage nobility, it was very mid. I'm sure this Norton brat thought his life sucked, but it's actually pretty awesome. I have no problem enjoying his shitty life. Rhys pinched his chin suddenly, feeling as though he'd had an epiphany. A good life or a bad life, it was all based on personal perspective, wasn't it? He'd consider this life great, but Norton, and probably many other mage nobles, would consider it bad. In other words, although this was fantastic to him, it was trash to Norton. By taking on Norton's perspective, he was able to bring this entire house, and, in fact, Norton's entire life, into his domain. Suddenly, he felt as though he'd known the house for years. The maid felt familiar, and Lily seemed important. The scuffs on the floor, the slight stains on the wall where furniture had rubbed, all of it made sense to him. He didn't see what had happened, nor did he instantly know everything about the house and the people in it, but he felt the vibes, so to speak. He went from guessing blind at what was going on in here, to being able to read every hint in detail, and figure out what was going on around him. He turned, looking at the wall behind him. There was a smudge on the wallpaper even with the back of his chair. Norton had slammed this chair back often. His eyes tracked to the floor, where the boards were slightly more worn than in other places. And he stomped off often, all the way up to his room. His eyes darted across the room, landing on one set of clues, then another, his eyes glowing faintly with green-brown light. A smile slowly stretched across his face. This is awesome. I turned on Sherlock Holmes mode. Rhys leaned back, propping his feet up on the corner of the table where faint impurities indicated Norton often did. In a split second, he'd gone from cringing his way around the house, to the true master of the house, almost as knowledgeable of Norton's life as the man himself would be. No, more knowledgeable than Norton was of his own life, since Norton doubtlessly did some of the things he did subconsciously, but Rhys was now consciously aware of them all. He nodded to himself, deeply pleased with this new epiphany. It wasn't the unlock to break through his bottleneck, but it was highly convenient right now. The maid returned with a plate of fresh eggs, toast, and bacon. Rhys quickly scanned the grease stains on the table to confirm that it was Norton's favorite breakfast. He smiled and nodded for her to put it on the table, then froze. Impurities emanated from the meal. He sniffed, then raised his brows. Poison. How considerate of them, to give him some training. Not. Someone wants Norton dead. Rhys scanned the maid's fingertips and found them stained with impurities, too. He glanced at her. A jilted lover. A faint flash of disgust played over her face, and she pivoted on her heel and marched off, hair flowing behind her. Well, it's common enough, as a motivation for murder. And that's exactly why I've remained relationship-free all these years. Fewer people trying to kill me. Right, without any jilted lovers on my case, the only people who want to kill me are, most of the Empire, and the leadership of the Alliance. Anyways, it's totally a legitimate and ordinary survival strategy. Definitely not because I'm too socially inept to find a partner, haha. Rhys quickly dragged Norton's body out of the pre-processing pile for the trash star and gave it a quick scan. More impurities that matched the ones in his current meal swirled in this man's body. It seemed he'd been marked for death for some time. He brightened, tossing the body back toward the trash star. Excellent. It was a slow-working poison, then. He wouldn't have to discover the poisoner, he could just play along, eat his eggs like a good little Norton, and faff about his life as if nothing was wrong, and the maid would think all was going according to plan. Plus, with as shitty a person as Norton was, it was quite possible that his poisoning was a conspiracy that went beyond one maid. No point revealing his hand now when he could enjoy picking apart this mystery while he waited for ball season to arrive. If it turned out it was just a scheme by the maid to poison him, too, then it was better not to tip his hand at all. The last thing he needed was attention from Norton's family, which would doubtlessly rush his way the second he revealed he was being poisoned. Norton was still receiving money, after all. He wasn't completely kicked out of the family. Parents who completely ignored and hated their children would still come running when they heard their children had been harmed. So, ignoring the poison laced in the food, Rhys gobbled down the otherwise delicious-smelling breakfast. The poison honestly wasn't bad. It added a bit of peppery spice to the eggs, to Rhys's enhanced mage tongue, and since he wasn't harmed by the impurities at all, it was basically nothing but seasonings. He shook his head in mild disapproval. He shouldn't be able to taste these impurities. What amateur poisoning. True, he'd fully controlled the potato chips so that mages didn't know what they were supposed to taste like without impurities, but still. This was weak sauce poisoning. He could clearly taste the difference. The maid stood in the corner of the room, quietly watching him. To his eyes, her expression simmered with quiet satisfaction. He snorted to himself, shaking his head a little. Unfortunately for her, the poison wouldn't do anything to him. Fortunately for her, Norton was already dead. Whatever reason she had for poisoning him, he'd already been punished as much as he could be. Rhys paused in the middle of eating his eggs as a thought came to him, a bite of egg an inch from his mouth. Is there a problem? The maid asked, concern, almost earnest looking, flashing over her face. No, it's nothing, Rhys said, waving his hand. I wasn't thinking about my exit strategy. Absorbing Norton into the star. That's a total waste. I should preserve that body and drop it behind me when I leave, full of impurities from this poison. Then the justice system can adequately punish whoever needs to be punished for the poisoning. Norton can die of what he was going to die of anyways before my intervention, and I can smoothly slip away, as if I never existed. He put the bite of egg in his mouth and chewed, while internally, he moved Norton out of the burnable trash pile, destined for the trash star, into the preserved trash pile. The high mana, low everything else setting of his core already preserved Norton's corpse to a high degree, and now that he'd thought about it, he kept a thin stream of mana flowing to the man's body to prevent any further deterioration. It had begun to rot a little bit, but that was fine. Whenever he ditched Norton's body, he'd just have to take care to ditch it somewhere where it wouldn't be found for a few days, and it would be all the same to the mages in this world, who weren't exactly forensic experts. They'd be able to tell that he'd died of poison, and that he'd begun to rot, but that was about it. Anything more complicated was out of the question. Wiping up the spilled yolk with his toast, Rhys hummed happily to himself. I'm mad scientist, so cool, son of a bitch. Forget Sherlock Holmes, I'm Moriarty. It was subtle at first. Quieter footfalls on the stairs. A cringing response. A promise of improvement. Lily didn't believe it. She would have been a fool to believe it. He'd promised such things many times. There would be a day or two of improvement, and then he'd be back to his usual habits. That was the way it always was. That was the way it had been his whole life, even before she'd had the misfortune of being pressed into this arranged marriage. But this time, he didn't. She came home from shopping and sensed him on the rooftop gardens. Confused, she climbed the stairs to find him, not passed out drunk surrounded by bottles, not sniffing some new sugar, but quietly working on his mage hood. Colored lights swirled around him, and small phenomena appeared around his feet. For some reason, they looked like crumpled paper, broken glass, and other trash. There was no other word for it, rather than the usual flowers and beautiful things that sometimes blossomed around mages lost in deep contemplation of their paths. Still, it meant that he was undoubtedly actually working on his path, not just high and pretending to cultivate. Flabbergasted, Lily stared for a few seconds, then shut the door and walked away. This wouldn't last. He'd be back to his old habits before long. I didn't even know he had a path. Days passed, turning into weeks. To her shock, Norton did not return to his usual habits. He practiced, occasionally came down for meals, and kept to himself. One day, she spent the whole day messing around the house, straightening and rearranging things, even though that was the maid's job. He was sneaking out, surely. Running around while she was out on the town conducting the duties a family of their stature ought to complete together. But no, he sat in the gardens, barely moving, working hard on his practice. That night, when he slept, because strangely, he was eating 3 meals a day and sleeping at night like a mortal, or a highly principled member of the nobility acting according to the modern fashion, whereas before he'd subsisted on a nap every few weeks, alcohol, and his potions, she went up to the gardens and scoured every plant, every inch of the dirt, every stone in the path. He had to have something. Some stash he was secretly breaking into while she wasn't looking. Nothing. She turned the garden over, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. Not a single fleck of sugar or single drop of potion. Not even a bottle of alcohol. He was keeping his word, he'd completely gone clean. But it wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. She'd known him since childhood, since their marriage had been decided not long after their respective births, to bring their two families together as part of some pact or treaty. She didn't care. Even as a child, he'd shown signs of addictive behavior, seeking out sweets and sneaking alcohol from their parents' cabinets. It had only gotten worse as he'd reached adulthood and become able to use his own money to purchase alcohol, then more exciting pursuits. No serious mage would ever try the recreational potions Norton sought out. They were full of impurities and filth, and basically marked the end of a mage's progression. But Norton didn't care. He never cared about anything but his own desires, and getting his next hit of his own personal joy, better if it was to the detriment of others. It wasn't possible. Except that it was, because he was in the garden, right now, quietly practicing, and she glanced out the window, checking the sun. In another 15 minutes or so, he'd come down for lunch, just like clockwork. He'd gone from the terribly interesting Norton, terrible in its truest form, so terribly interesting, that she had spent years wishing, hoping, praying for him to stop being so interesting, to a boring nobleman, one of those stodgy types who kept a neat calendar and attended all his appointments right on time. If she didn't know better, she might think he was a different person entirely. But he was Norton, undoubtedly so. She was only tier 2, only a little higher than Norton. She'd been married off because of her low potential and general hopelessness as a mage. Still, her eyes were enhanced, and she had mana senses. Through every sense she possessed, he was Norton, down to the inescapable reek of filth that always clung to him after a long night. He would have to be a much higher tier, the kind of high tier that rarely appeared in the Alliance, in order to fool her, and as far as she knew, none of the high nobles, military generals, or the Sword Saint had ever had any interest in pretending to be her shitty husband. The mere thought of some tier 3, let alone 4 or 5, taking the place of her husband was absolutely laughable. And then, one day, someone knocked on her door. She didn't have many guests. Usually, she visited her friends' houses, to avoid embarrassing herself if Norton decided to show up and harass them. Her friends understood, and quietly made a point of never showing up unannounced. Instead, they'd invite her out, or offer an open invite to their houses, in case she ever needed a quick escape. The only people who would come knocking on her door were her parents or her in-laws, but they, too, would schedule in advance, being the ones most privy to Norton's excesses. So when she opened the door to find Norton's mother standing on the other side, her jaw dropped. Madam Tunk, she said, quickly bowing to the elder mage. Haven't I told you to call me mother? Come along, dear. Give your mother a big hug. Madam Tunk had preserved herself in her early 20s, so it was always a bit of a mental scramble when she spoke like an old lady, as she liked to do. Lately, there'd been a few streaks of gray in her hair, and Lily had been wondering if she wasn't, perhaps, aging herself up subtly to gain a bit more respectability and weight around court, or if she was simply following the modern trend of white streaks in the hair. Either way, she wasn't going to comment on it until her mother-in-law commented on it first. I understand Norton has been practicing lately, Madam Tunk said, as they pulled out of the hug. He's been quite diligent, Lily agreed. Fear spiked. How did Madam Tunk know? Had she bugged the manor? It wouldn't be out of character for her. Take me to see him, she demanded, pulling off her heavy fur coat and draping it on the coat hook by the door. Lily nodded. Whatever reason Madam Tunk had arrived, there was nothing she could do but bow and obey the mage. Madam Tunk was almost tier 4, with a powerful set of techniques that allowed her to fight low tier 4 mages and earned her the respect of the entire alliance. She was naught but chaff before her, and though her own family was enough guarantee for Lily to not fear for her life, if Madam Tunk found reason to end it, there was little Lily could do to stop her. Norton's new habits were positive, but if he was an imposter, and she was simply too weak to sense it, then Madam Tunk would be in the right to end her life. Oh, dear girl, what's troubling you? Madam Tunk asked gently. Nothing. He's changed so much, lately, Lily said, leading her toward the garden. I feel like I barely know him anymore. Madam Tunk waved her hand. No, don't fear, my dear. This is a positive change. I'm excited to see my lovely son turn over a new leaf. Lily nodded, not quite able to quell her nerves. The garden door loomed before her. She took a deep breath and threw it open. Norton sat in the center of the garden, quietly practicing with eyes shut and legs crossed. Colored lights and phenomena played around him, glittering gently with scintillating light. He didn't move when the two of them walked in, but Lily faintly felt a mana probe play over them, then retreat, rapidly, as if shocked. Well, Madam Tunk murmured to herself. She narrowed her eyes. Norton continued to practice, but there were no colors or phenomena anymore. Lily got the sense that he was faking. She glanced at Madam Tunk, swallowing. That reaction wasn't good. Was he a fake, after all? And then Madam Tunk beamed. How wonderful. My son has improved by leaps and bounds, more than I could have ever imagined he would have. Lily breathed out. She laughed, half out of nervousness. I was surprised too, madam. Yes, what an incredible improvement. Why, I would hardly believe this is my son, if I didn't see it with my own 2 eyes. Wonderful. I don't suppose my wonderful son would continue to practice with his mother here, even if he's suddenly become diligent. No, my son would always greet his mother with enthusiasm, right? Lily blinked at Madam Tunk. That wasn't true at all. Norton regularly called his mother a plague and complained about her visits, even openly to her face. She tolerated it, because he was her son, but enthusiastic, Norton was not. To her shock, Norton stood and beamed at his mother, stretching out his arms. Mother, how good to see you. My beautiful son. Oh, it's so good to see you. The madam hugged him tight, patting his back. How wonderful. I'm so happy you're part of our family. Now Lily just stared, completely lost. Madam Tunk was never this warm. Even in the rare moments she was pleased with Norton, mostly her husband's fault that he gave his mother so little happiness, in Lily's opinion, she was always reserved and cold. This display of affection was, beyond rare. No, even in childhood, she wasn't sure if she'd ever seen the madam act this way toward her son, toward anyone. Of course, mother. Lily blinked at Norton. Since when did he call her, mother? Since when did he call anyone anything other than, you? Of course, of course. His mother stepped back, looking him up and down. She clapped his shoulders, then nodded. Now that my son is putting so much effort into his manhood, how can a mother like me stand still? I'll be back tomorrow with some materials for you, just a few small herbs and spiritual stones to help you along. Oh, this is wonderful, wonderful news. Norton laughed. Lily glanced at him. Was it just her, or was there a note of nervousness mixed into his voice? No, no, mother. There's no need. As you can see, I have everything I need right here, with the sky and the earth below me. Madame Tunk gasped. My son is so modest. How could I not shower such a wonderful son with gifts? No, no. You'll have everything you need in no time flat. She headed for the exit, then paused. My dear son, please, keep practicing. Lily can see me out. Norton nodded, smiling awkwardly. Of course. Madame Tunk turned. With one glance back at Norton, who did obediently sit back down and return to practicing, Lily hurried after her. They walked down to the door in silence. At the door, Madame Tunk glanced upward, then waved her hand, and a bubble of silence closed around them. Instantly, the smile vanished, and Madame Tunk turned serious instead. She looked Lily in the eye. Has your husband been particularly affectionate lately? No more than usual, Lily demurred, which was to say, he'd ignored her. Madame Tunk pursed her lips. So it's not you he wants. Mother-in-law. No, no. Don't mind me. Treat your husband well, won't you? I'll be back in short order with those supplies. Lily blinked. Is he not? Of course he is. How could I not recognize my son? Madame Tunk cut her off, before she could even finish saying anything. My son has turned over a new leaf, and he's decided to make something of himself. Why would I not be overjoyed? Why, if he suddenly had a precipitous climb in power to jump several tiers in a night, I wouldn't be shocked, so great is his sudden new devotion to magecraft. There was a strange light in Madame Tunk's eyes, the same greed that she usually turned toward her family's business endeavors. Madam, what a valuable gift, a fortuitous encounter. God's only knows what he's after, but as long as he's in our family, we ought to reap the benefits, or at least work toward a positive relationship. Truly, I have gained much and lost little today, Madame Tunk murmured to herself. She looked at Lily. We, of course, never had this conversation. Care for your loving husband as you always have. Don't do anything that he doesn't like, regardless of what it might be. If you can capture him with your wiles, but don't run him off if he is disinterested. Yes. I'm not sure I follow, Lily said, a bit overwhelmed. Madame Tunk looked at her with more dismissal in her eyes than Lily had ever seen before. That man is Norton Tunk. Are we in agreement? Why yes. Then that is all you need to know. Madame Tunk waved her hand. The bubble broke, and, taking her fur coat, she swept onto the streets. Lily gazed after her, sure of nothing except that the man upstairs was not her husband. But if Madame Tunk hadn't called him out, then, that could only mean that he was more powerful, even, than her. And she was considered the powerhouse of the Tunk family. Slowly, Lily lifted her gaze to the ceiling, as if she could see straight through the house to where her husband practiced on the roof. She swallowed. Sitting on the roof of the manor, Rhys sweated. He licked his lips and watched the woman go. She'd noticed. She'd definitely noticed. And, she hadn't been angry. Or scared, or sad. She'd seemed happy. Well, she was high enough tier that I think she was able to somewhat see through my tear suppression, to at least see that I was suppressing my tear. She basically upgraded her drunk low-tier son with no hope for improvement with a high-ranked tier 4 with none of his unfortunate social habits. And due to the fact that I'm on a stealth mission, she can leverage me to assist her family in ways that she usually would have no option to, especially if she deliberately showers me with gifts to help earn my favor. He thought for a second, then shrugged. He didn't mind. Bribery was hella pog, especially since he was a trashy guy. What was more trashy than accepting bribery? And he himself had taken on a side quest or two in his time. Gods knew the Lord Norse side quest had achieved little, except for the part where he'd met Sid, and incidentally, hadn't forgotten any of that. If everything went right, they'd be part of his endgame. Plus, mage bribery was basically a tradition. No one got anywhere without relying on bribery and connections. He'd avoided it so far by living in the trash, but now that it had presented itself as an option, there was no reason to hold back. Who knew? Maybe all the Tunks wanted was for him to stand around and look pretty, and maybe scare away a rival or two. Or, well, mages were known for taking the long view on things. They could live for hundreds of years. Doing a small favor for him now by overlooking him taking the place of their erstwhile child and presenting him with a few gifts, could pay off enormously later if they were ever in need of a powerful supporter. I don't mind having their back later. I'll accept their kindness now. It's better than if they reveal me, for sure. Then he'd have to totally throw this plan out the window, or kill and replace many, many more people than he had any confidence in replacing. Yeah, at that point, I might have to kill them all, retreat, and come back later, Rhys thought with a sigh. Which really made his, mom's, choice all the more expedient. If she'd protested, he could, and would, have killed her. Between granting a high-tier mage a favor which they could call in later, and the eradication of her family, Madame Tunk had certainly picked the better option. It wasn't like a high-tier 3 could stop him. Rhys sighed. I really don't belong in the alliance anymore. He was rapidly becoming a big fish in a small pond. If he wanted to keep growing, he had to move on and up, where he could continue to be trash and others could continue to pose a serious challenge to him. Stagnating here where he was on top wasn't the way to accomplish his, or absolute existence's, goals. Still, for now, he would take advantage of his relatively high tier to successfully replace Norton, even though Norton's mother had immediately seen through Rhys's disguise. Just because he thought it was distasteful to be the big fish in the small pond, didn't mean he wouldn't lord it over the small pond for as long as he still had business there. He didn't outrank the whole pond, anyways. The Sword Saint, and a few others, still loomed over him, but he did have to admit there were few still above him. Once he got to a nameable list, that was already too few for comfort. All it meant was that nothing changed. Madame Tunk knew, but wasn't going to report him. Whether or not his supposed wife knew, he was willing to bet that Madame Tunk's word would override hers. It no longer mattered whether or not she suspected him. Of course, that was no reason to treat her any differently. He still intended to be the Norton Tunk who turned over a new leaf and has suddenly become a good husband. That Norton Tunk was the one who got invited to parties. I suppose I should strive to not involve the Tunks in whatever my eventual reveal plan is. It would be rude to repay their kindness by dropping his false identity in a way that implicated them. It wouldn't be too hard to accomplish, either, since even if he was caught red-handed with Norton's face, he could always claim that he'd fooled the Tunks. It was just a matter of remembering not to toss his trash on their lawn. It was, he had to admit, a trashy thing to do, to repay a favor with a giant middle finger, but he wasn't that trashy. Even he had limits. Things could change, of course. If the Tunks turned out to be as assholish as the son he'd replaced, then maybe they deserved that kind of underhanded betrayal. He just didn't know. In some cases, assholes begat assholes. In other cases, the kid was just wired wrong, and perfectly lovely, or at least acceptable, people could end up with a highly troublesome kid. He'd keep his eyes out, but his default was to repay kindness with kindness. He wasn't going to play moral police, either. Far be it from him to be that trashy. As long as they weren't completely deplorable, it was kindness with kindness. Only in the extreme case would he act against them. That was definitely something he'd run into a lot, especially working for a living in his first life. When he said something like, I need to make sure this isn't bad, what he meant was, if it was 70% okay, it was passing, whereas what others heard was if it's 10% bad, I'm destroying it. The most confusing part of communication, as far as Rhys was concerned, wasn't conveying the general status or information, but instead calibrating the other person's base assumptions and expectations to match his own. It was so easy to think that you and the person you were speaking with knew exactly what you meant, when they were really so far off base that they might as well be in another universe, just because they started from some strange beginning point. Rhys sighed aloud. Just more proof that people were annoying and ought to be avoided, writ large. Writ small, people were great, his friends and such. Writ large, yeah, nah. He went back to focusing on his practice. The bottleneck still loomed, but at this point, the biggest problem was that he didn't know exactly what the bottleneck was. He could feel it, but what was it? What was blocking his progress? Something, for sure, but whatever it was eluding him. And the problem was that it could be anything. Trash, the void, the hole in his core wall, the fact that he was effectively cultivating a trash star rather than a core. There was so much strange and weird about his cultivation that he just didn't know where to start. He ran through each option, or rather, was running through each one, exhaustively, but he still hadn't found the smoking gun. And there was always the option that what he needed was brute force. Vast quantities of trash, immense heaps of rapidly processed filth. True, it hadn't worked back when he'd been with Soma. He'd been forced to make the hunger instead, who was currently sleeping in his core. But who knew? Maybe what he needed was time for his core and core space to settle and expand, and then brute force. Order of operations was important. He expected things to be quiet for a while, but contrary to his expectations, the sun hadn't set before he sensed the Mana signature he now recognized as Madame Tunk at the door again. Lily answered the door, then headed directly up to him. Rhys stood, turning to face the door as she opened it. She jumped, a little taken aback to find him looking directly at her. Rhys smiled and waited patiently for her to say her piece. After a beat, Lily recovered enough to thrust a ring at him. Here, cultivation materials. Madame Tunk brought them. Rhys took the ring and quickly went through the materials on the inside. Potions, gems, a few sets of herbs and a full explanation of how to cook them into a powerful potion designed to thrust one's magehood ahead toward the brink of the next tier. Rhys nodded, then looked at Lily. She was mid-retreat, but paused when their eyes met. "Do you want any of these?" he asked. "Do I have no talent as a mage. You know this, husband. Using those high-quality materials on me would be a waste." Rhys smiled, not sure how to explain that they'd be even more wasted on someone like him, who needed filth more than he needed high-quality materials. And then his eyes lit up. "Did you say you have no talent?" "Why yes. Would you consider yourself trash?" "Not that far, but have others considered you trash?" She looked down, then stared him in the eye, tears glittering in her eyes. "Why are you asking these things?" Rhys gripped her by the shoulders. "I'm going to make you the strongest trash mage who's ever walked this city. Madame Tunk brought those materials for you. If you use them on me, she gave them to me, no. Is it not my choice what I decide to do with them? If she bullies you for it, then send her to me. I'll tell her directly that it was my willfulness, not anything on your part." Lily started to nod, then frowned. Why what? You said it. I'm not a very good mage. So why do you want to fight uphill?" Rhys just grinned. "Call it your husband's love." Lily grimaced at that, as if she was a second away from puking. Rhys chuckled and patted her on the shoulder. "Get ready. I've never gone all in on power leveling someone else before. You're going to be my guinea pig." Lily took an involuntary step back, suddenly much more concerned than she was before. "What's a guinea pig?" "Sorry. Let me rephrase. My dear beloved disciple." Somehow, that didn't ease the fearful expression on her face. Rhys cackled under his breath. He tossed her a potion from the ring. "Here. Drink this and let me see how you circulate it." Still deeply uncertain, Lily put the potion to her lips. She took a small sip. Rhys put a hand on her shoulder, extending his skill less as more toward her. He felt their mana brush, and then his skill surged over her, accelerating the intensity of the small sip of mana she'd taken. Her eyes widened, and she put a hand to her core, backing away again. "Don't back away. Don't reject it. You can handle that much mana. Hang on to it, and circulate it. Expand your core, and expand the space your core lives in." "That's not possible." "I don't care if it's possible or not. You're doing it, and you're doing it now." Lily jolted. Startled into action, she circulated her mana, obediently trying to absorb the excess mana from the potion into her body. To be honest, Rhys was just copying the garbage advice his high school coaches had shouted in his face, in the hopeless endeavor of attempting to get the fat kid he'd been to succeed at any active event, but it worked shockingly well. When he thought about it, though, it made sense. Not only was it garbage advice and therefore in line with his path, but also, she was a noble who'd been treated with kid gloves and a delicate touch her whole life. No one had ever shouted at her to work harder or get the job done. If she'd said she couldn't do it, they'd simply backed off and allowed that to be reality. But Rhys had nothing to fear. Not from her family, who were at best as strong as Madame Tunk, and quite possibly weaker, if they'd agreed to marry her to the obviously flawed Norton Tunk, and not from Lily herself, who couldn't do any more harm to him than to throw a tantrum. He wasn't afraid of a spoiled brat. Not only that, but she was legitimately so much weaker than him that she could qualify as his disciple or student. In fact, if she had enough sense to realize what was happening, she'd get with the system and start cooperating pretty quickly once she realized how fortuitous a situation this was for her. Then again, I don't mind if she doesn't. A bad student is better for me. Rare is the good student who's considered garbage. Sweat dripped down Lily's brow. I can't. You can, and you will. You're not allowed to give up. Rhys stood over Lily, arms folded, frowning like a drill instructor. When she finished absorbing her first sip, he immediately forced her to take another, all under the influence of less is more. The skill had somewhat worn out for his personal usage, since by now, more was more. His star simply needed vast quantities of trash and filth, and no amount of less is more could make it worthwhile to take in the vast quantities he required one piece of trash at a time, so that less is more could activate. It was like taking your trash to the dump one piece of plastic wrap, paper, or cardboard at a time. Sure, He could do it, could have done it in his first life, too, but the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Not in this life or the previous one. Lost, Lily obeyed his orders, though she seemed more confused than converted to the idea of growing stronger. He could just about see the anime-style swirlies in her eyes. Clearly, no one had ever believed in her ability before, to the point that she'd completely internalized her uselessness. And Rhys had to admit, she wasn't amazing. She had about average talent, maybe low or low average. In fact, she might even rank lower on the talent totem pole than Rhys's instincts rated her, since he'd come from a small-time school with no outstanding talents to speak of, and the outliers in his life such as Bast were so far beyond the curve that they weren't worth comparing anyone to. Still, by the time they worked their way through the potion, Lily had advanced in her magehood. It wasn't by leaps and bounds, but it was steady, incremental improvement. So, what do you think? Rhys asked, giving her a steady smile. Lily frowned, then sent her mana senses inward. There was a pause while she surveyed her core, then jerked out. By her expression of utter shock, even this kind of incremental improvement was something she hadn't experienced in a long time. What? How? That was just one potion, I didn't even know you could grow from an ordinary mana potion, Lily murmured, half to herself. Rhys smiled. You can grow from anything. That is truly incredible. I might even reach tier 3 this way, she murmured. Eventually, maybe, Rhys said, not wanting to overpromise. He probably wouldn't stick around for long enough to push her all the way to tier 3, but he wasn't going to tell her it wasn't possible for her to reach tier 3. Her talent wasn't flashy, but it wasn't nothing, either. If she ground, and really tried, she could definitely push tier 3 or even 4, though it'd probably take her a few hundred years. The only reason she'd stalled out at tier 2 was because she had stopped trying. He kind of understood it, too. Sure, she was surrounded by resources, but surrounded by resources that she, and everyone else, could see were better off going to whoever was the most talented in her family. She came from a small noble family, one so poorly off that they benefited from marrying their daughter off to a mage who topped out at tier 2. They didn't have infinite resources, but they did have resources. In that situation, not only would all the resources get siphoned off to the most talented member of her noble family, but also the most talented member of the family would naturally grow stronger than her. With all the resources, they would only grow even faster. Lily could then easily conflate the talented person's growth with having resources, see that she wasn't allocated resources, and assume that she wasn't growing because she didn't have resources, then conclude that growth without resources wasn't possible. It was a very mind-fucked state, but it was the exact kind of mental trap that Rhys remembered having fallen into as a young adult, when everyone else, aka the rich kids on social media with rich parents, was going to clubs and expensive parties and meeting cool people, and he was poor, living in a cockroach-filled apartment, and scraping by on ramen. It wasn't impossible to imagine that Lily might fall into the same kind of, the rich get richer, mental hole and give up. In that way, having had resources but having been denied them had created a mental block for Lily, that those who had never had resources, like Rhys, had never been exposed to. In this world, at least. He couldn't underestimate the fact that she was a noble, either. She'd doubtlessly been brought up as a precious brat, whom everyone was afraid to touch for fear of insulting her family. He had nothing to fear, since no one in her or her husband's, his family was going to touch him, so he could order her around with impunity. Plus, things would come down on his assumed identity's noble family, not on him, so he was extra super double clean. I'm pretty sure this isn't how most. I replaced the husband, fix go, a little voice in the back of Rhys's head whispered, but he smacked it down. No. Bad brain. He'd already said he wasn't going to go the hentai route. This was a good and upright relationship between a master and a disciple, and that was all. Husband, wife, not at all. That would be immoral and improper. There were trashy lines that he wasn't going to cross, and that was definitely one of them. Lily really wasn't his type, either. She was attractive, don't get him wrong, but kind of neutral flavor, mildly inbred, old money attractive. He was a little shocked that she didn't have drilled tails. That was probably the best way to explain how she looked. She would be the villainess in any Otome work. The villainesses were always attractive, of course. That went without saying, but they were the second lady for a reason, and the main character was always more attractive, if plainer, from an in-world perspective. Between her and the maid, they were honestly the perfect duo of villainess and sidekick. Lily just needed those aforementioned drilled tails, aka twin drills or ringlets, and the maid just needed slightly thicker brows, glasses, an upturned nose, or freckles, some minor but severe imperfections, so it was clear she wasn't in the running for the all-important male lead. Though honestly, who read an Otome for the male lead? They were always boring white bread beta men, bland and flavorless, nothing but an empty head with a pretty face pasted on. The real romance was the energy shared between the heroine and the villainess. No woman got that obsessed with another woman without a little attraction going between the two of them, or so he imagined. He didn't really know that much about women. His mind wandered as he had Lily continue to go through the paces, standing over her while she sat down and focused on her core, on circulating all the energy she'd just added to it and stabilizing her progress so it didn't fall apart when she lost focus. Mouse would be the perfect female lead for an otome. The long bangs, the glasses, but then when you pull back her hair, he paused. Huh, come to think of it, I've never seen her with her hair up. He'd taken her to a ball or two, but usually as a maid, and what was more classic than a maid with thick glasses and heavy bangs? And he, gods damn it, was a sucker for the classic maid. Given the opportunity to have a friend dress up in one of those cute black dresses with the little white apron, he wasn't going to say no, much less force her to step outside the perfect maid aesthetic. Why mess with perfection? At least he wasn't one of those clueless otome male leads. He'd recognize her with her hair up, 100%. She had that cute upturned nose and the cute round cheeks, and the rest of her face too, probably. The glasses and the hair really hid a lot. But they didn't hide everything, and he wasn't stupid. He would recognize her. Absolutely. Unless she was using her invisibility mode, and then he wouldn't see a thing. Still, that wasn't on him. That was on her for using her technique on him. Even if he still remembered her, he couldn't see through her actively using her techniques against him. I really wish I got why she let me, and only me, remember her. He paused for a second, then shrugged. At least I'm not some oblivious otome lead, though. Those guys just couldn't catch a hint if it slapped them in the face. He wasn't the greatest at reading romantic cues, but he was better than them. Right. Something brushed at the very limits of his mana senses. Rhys froze. He turned and stared, not extending his mana senses any further, but simply watching with the very limits of what he had. He recognized that cursed energy. Or should he say those cursed energies? He recognized the aura of the person the cursed energy was attached to, too. How could he not? It was his old nemesis Ernesto. None of the man's one-time apprentices were around, not from the girl in the gothic Lolita dress, Hano, to the noble boy seeking vengeance, whose name he'd completely and totally forgotten. He watched the man walk by and stood there, not moving a muscle, not even changing the flow of his mana. Just watching. 1,000 thoughts instantly pounded through his head. Is this a trick? A trap? This is where he lives. It might just be his honest route. I haven't noticed him the entire time I was sitting out on the streets. Yeah, near the red light district. Fat chance a nerd like Ernesto was spending a lot of time there. It's been 2 days. I know someone saw through me, not to my true identity, but through my false identity at the very least. Immediately afterwards, Ernesto shows up. What are the odds? He lives here. Lives. Here. He's a noble. He's integrated into the government, I know that, and he's a cursed energy expert. This all falls into place. There's nothing weird about him walking through this district. This should be his stomping grounds. Coincidences are real. Sometimes, people just happen to intersect. I mean, there was that guy who failed to assassinate the Archduke, gave up, went and got a sandwich, and then walked out of his sandwich shop to find out that the Archduke's car had broken down and been diverted to right outside of the sandwich shop. That's a real thing that happened. This is way less coincidental than that, and that not only is real, but set off a world war. These things can happen. They don't have to be an evil plot to capture me in particular. But if I was an evil person plotting to capture me in particular, I would do exactly this. Have this man walk by my hideout. It's like catnip to a cat. Like waggling a raw steak in front of a tiger. They know I want to find Ernesto. He's my #1 target. And he just walks by my house. That's impossible. It's not real. It's very possible. It is real. It just happened, right there, right now. And it's not even that far beyond the pale. It's a very realistic scenario that could very easily play out in the real world without anyone scheming anything. Norton, Lily asked, peeking up at him. She laid flat on the ground, sweating heavily. He'd accidentally extended his pressure and pushed her down without realizing it. Rhys took a deep breath and reined his pressure in. Lily sighed in relief and sat up. He watched as Ernesto left the range of his senses and did nothing. Not now. Not yet. There were thousands of subtle things he could do if he had time and prepared. Nothing he could do right now was subtle. Right now, he couldn't blow open his entire plan to chase down one man. He was so close to finishing it all. Now was not the time to get hasty. What are we doing next? Lily asked. Rhys waved his hand. Keep drinking those potions. Drink until you feel overfull, then focus on growing your core the way I taught you. Don't be afraid to change the formula or do what you need to do to make yourself stronger. Being a mage is all about improvising. With that, he swept off. He wasn't going to move now, but he wasn't going to not move, either. If this was real, then he knew that Ernesto came through this neighborhood. It was time to go put together his subtle plans. Little things that wouldn't blow open his main plan, but that would give him a backup if things went wrong, too. I've started my plan 1. It's time to get plans 2 to 10 going, too. Rhys sat in the smoking room, immensely focused on the tiny thing he was crafting. At a distance, Ernesto had scanned his tier 3. If he made these small enough, the man wouldn't notice them, and if all went well, he might be able to pull off a double whammy on the alliance. A true heist for the ages. He just couldn't let anyone see what he was doing, hence the smoking room. He didn't have a barrier technique, but Mana's senses, except for his, naturally deteriorated when they came in contact with impurities. The smoking room was usually hard to scan, and with a few choice additions of special impurities, he made it all but unreadable. Not completely blacked out, but so full of static and low resolution that no one would bother looking hard enough to figure out what he was doing. If the inside of the smoking room was usually reduced from 4K to 720p in people's Mana senses, he'd reduced it to 180p, like a really old, very pirated 90s or 80s era anime where the pirates had to rip it from a DVD, or worse, a VHS, all striped with heat and speckled with the corruption of 1,000 recopyings, the audio desensed and the frames reduced to 5 per second. Really hard to figure out what was going on inside it, but not so opaque it would stand out as obviously hidden. At worst, someone might wonder what Norton was smoking to make it so bad in there, and if they managed to peer inside to see Rhys fiddling with something tiny with his hands, they'd just assume it was Norton playing with his salts and sugars again. There's some really fantastic classics that have been demoted to trash because of that, because of old and bad piracy, Rhys mused, as he put the finishing touches on the first of many, planned 2s. There was one in particular about a tutu-wearing duckling-turned-girl, one of the foundational magical girls animes, that had almost completely fallen from the public consciousness due to it being hard to find and consume and nearly unwatchable in its pirated state. He felt a great mournfulness in his heart for that, even more so than for the trash that was ignored because it had a flaw or two. The tutu duckling truly was a masterpiece, and yet, it had fallen by the wayside and tumbled into the garbage just because none of the popular official sites had it. And because it had last been pirated in the early 80s, if the state of the pirated copy was anything to go off of. It didn't deserve the trash treatment. It deserved the spotlight and adoration of the masses. But only the trash dwellers like himself ever stumbled upon it, because no spotlight-seeking, masterpiece-watching normie would ever delve deep enough to find it. It wasn't that he was special for knowing it. Perish the thought, that was a stupid way to be, and Rhys had rejected it with the rest of his cringe 15-year-old chunny self. No, what he mourned was that he couldn't bring it up and get instant recognition at anime conventions, or speak about it with a casual friend and expect them to know anything about it, despite it being good enough that they should know about it. It was the sadness of watching dust gather on the Mona Lisa, of finding a lone recording of Beethoven's Fifth and knowing that no one but filth like him would ever hear it. There was no remake, no anime cafes, no tributes, no exhibitions. It had been forgotten. Before long, its name would be spoken for the last time, and then it would be truly dead. It wasn't like that was the only one. There were many forgotten masterpieces. It was just that it was such a standout amongst the forgotten masterpieces that it made his heart hurt to know that it had been forgotten. He sighed aloud. And no one in this world will ever watch it, or any of the thousands of other anime I watched or manga I read. If there was one thing this world was missing, it was consumable media. His world had been overflowing with it, with more media than any one person could ever watch in their life. If one wanted only masterpieces, there were effectively infinite. If one preferred to peruse the trash, then the infinity of works available to one became meaninglessly larger. Sure, this world had books and large libraries, but most of the works were practical and focused on the progression of one's magehood. Which made sense. It really did. But he couldn't help but wish for the joyful slog of reading a truly trash work that maybe 100, 200 other people had ever read, and finding the spots of light and joy that truly shone from within its filth. Some should stay hidden, like the one about assassinating people who were close simulacrums for actual members of the Japanese Diet with a one-man, one-kill aesthetic. Some deserved more daylight, like the tutu duckling one. And then he laughed, tossing the finished, plan 2 feet into his storage ring. I think I'm probably the first person to ever go to another world and miss the utter depths of trash literature I used to have easy access to. There was a knock at the door. Rhys looked up. With Mana senses that were a little more conducive to filth than most people's, he could see the maid waiting outside the door, but nonetheless, he called out, "Who is it?" Helena, with your breakfast, sir. Come in. She opened the door, then coughed and waved her hand. It was fair enough, an ordinary mage would be highly sensitive to the impurities in the room, not to mention the lingering stink of smoke that even Rhys had to admit he didn't enjoy. She held out the tray, and Rhys walked over and took it. He took a bite of the eggs, then froze. The maid hesitated as well. Sir, the pepper. Where'd the spicy go? Rhys asked. It wasn't poisoned anymore. His breakfast was totally impurity-free. In fact, it was even purer than a usual breakfast. He'd gotten used to the poison to the point that he'd even started to look forward to the added flavor component that it added. It didn't harm him, either, so she'd basically just downgraded her recipe for no gain whatsoever on his part. He looked at her and gestured at the eggs. They were spicy. Her face reddened faintly. Sweat dripped down her forehead. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. The spice. You put it in the eggs. I remember I saw it on your fingertips. She retracted her hands sharply, hiding her fingers in her apron's pockets and started sweating even more profusely than before. Are you sure, sir? Oh, absolutely. I really like that flavor. Could you go back to the kitchen and put it on the eggs? Thanks. He held out the tray to her. Pale and trembling, she took the tray. A thought struck Rhys as she walked away, and he reached out and snagged her shoulder. Hey, don't kill yourself or anything, okay? I really don't mind. It's totally cool with me. There's no need to do some historical drama bullshit just because I called you out, okay? She grew even paler. The cutlery on the tray began to clatter, her hands were shaking so hard. Giving an empty nod, she stumbled away, almost as if numb. Rhys retreated into the room, but didn't go back to work. Instead, he watched her as she retreated to the kitchen, where Lily waited. Standing in silence, watching absolutely everything with his mana senses, he could reconstruct what they said by watching their lips. What is it? Lily asked. He said he wants his eggs spicy. He knows, Helena replied. Lily paled. The two of them stared at each other in dread and silence. After a second, Helena added, and he told me not to kill myself. He wants to torture us to death personally. Lily guessed. Helena looked down at her hands. She took a deep breath, clearly struggling, then nodded. It's all I can guess. Who knows what horrors await us if we try that kind of escape. Rhys flinched, taken aback. How did they get to that conclusion from him advocating against suicide? Mage logic was a little different from the logic he was used to, but that was a hell of a leap. Well, what can we do? Putting the poison back in is admitting that we were trying to poison him, Lily said. Her lips moved, and it looked like she wanted to say something else, but held it back at the last second. Rhys squinted, then realized. She suspected/knew he wasn't Norton, but didn't know what the result of telling Helena that would be. She's really afraid of me, huh? But he told me too. What happens if we refuse? Helena fretted, wringing her hands. Lily thought for a second. At last, she took a deep breath and nodded, steeling her resolve. We do it. He told us to. If he wanted us dead, he'd simply kill us already. Maybe, no. It's best to assume that this is what he actually wants. If this is a trap, then there's nothing we can do but fall into it, but like I said, he could kill us at any moment anyways. I really do think he just wants his eggs. What did he call them? Spicy, Helena said. Spicy. Give him spicy. Madame Tunk said to give him whatever he wants. If he wants spicy, so be it. Helena paled, but nodded. She bowed. It's been an honor, milady. No. You should be safe, Lily reassured her, hugging her. The two women clung to each other for a moment before they reluctantly parted, and Helena went to the cupboard, pressed a hidden button, and pulled out a small metal tin. Rhys rolled his eyes. All this drama for nothing. All they had to do was bring him his spicy eggs, and they'd find out it was all fine. Mage logic really was a mystery to him. Lower tier and mortal-born mages were relatively rational, but noble mages born into magic. Rhys couldn't even begin to comprehend what was going on with Lily and Helena. Even Madame Tunk had been a bit of a mystery, even if he'd eventually figured it out. Though, on the other hand, maybe I can use this trashy logic against them. Rhys pinched his chin. He thought for a few seconds, then shrugged. I can't come up with anything yet, but then, I don't know noble mage logic well enough yet. Once I become able to easily comprehend noble mage logic, then I'll be able to build a logic trap. It's foolish to attempt a logic trap while you don't understand the form of the enemy's logic. One must understand thine enemy, or whatever. Like most people who quoted Sun Tzu, Rhys had never read Sun Tzu. Though, to be honest, the only thing trashier than not reading Sun Tzu was reading Sun Tzu. He'd known a few of those kids in high school, and they were the most insufferable of all. Some of them were actual psychopaths, he was pretty sure, though not as good at it as the rare kid who read Machiavelli. The Machiavelli kids knew how to psychopath, the Sun Tzu kids were just fakers who thought they could psychopath. Wanting to be a psychopath wasn't necessarily worse than actually being a psychopath, but it was more annoying. The real psychopaths were just trying to live their lives. The fake ones wanted everyone to know how psycho they were. It was kind of his problem with philosophers all over again. To be honest, he just kind of hated fakers. It was a reasonable take, he thought. If you were going to do something, you should just do it. You accomplished nothing by faking something, but you accomplished a lot by actually doing something. And for some reason, fakers always wanted everyone to know exactly what they weren't actually doing. It was just confusing to him. I guess if they were actually doing it, they wouldn't need someone from outside to tell them they were doing it, whereas if they aren't actually doing it, they seek that affirmation from outside because they know, inside, that they aren't doing it. Whatever it is, he snorted. Pretty ironic that I hate fakers, but spend most of my time pretending to be other people. At least I'm not obnoxious about it, I guess, though it'd kinda ruin the point if I went around making sure everyone else knew I was faking being someone else. And then Rhys had an epiphany. Do I hate fakers because I always had to pretend to be normal? They were out there shouting about how cool they were for being different, while I was different, aka trash, and had to pretend to be normal just so I didn't get bullied to death. I was jealous of them, and angry that no one appreciated actually different people, but only liked fakers who were just acting up to get attention. He nodded, slowly. Yeah, I think that might be it. Well, always learning. Sometimes learning about the world, or mage noble logic, sometimes learning about myself. He turned his attention back to his plan too. Introspection aside, he had a regime to fell. He could figure out his personal hang-ups after he'd toppled the alliance. For the first time since he'd become Norton, Rhys headed out on the town. Lily followed him to the door, a bit like a lost puppy. There'd been a lot of that lately, ever since he'd requested spicy eggs. He didn't regret it, per se, but it was kind of annoying to watch the maid and the wife cringe every time he passed by. They'd get over it eventually, he kept telling himself, once they realized he had no intention to harm them, but until then, it was annoying as hell. Do you want me to come with you? She asked nervously. You can if you want, Rhys said evenly, not that worried one way or another. She wasn't going to see through his plan too, and if she usually went out with Norton, or even if she didn't, she'd only serve to help cement him as the new and improved Norton. He knew his mana signature was slightly different from the OG's, but he could sell that as a change and improvement in technique and a sudden seriousness toward magehood. It just wasn't the easiest sell when he had to sell that on top of suddenly overcoming addiction and giving up his fascination with brothels. In trashy novels, that kind of personal 180 happened all the time in the blink of an eye. It was bound to happen whenever a character suddenly discovered a particularly special spirit root or got introduced to their ring grandpa, or whatever other miracle they happened to encounter to make them the main character. There was even a high-flyingly proud novel on a certain royal website that he remembered enjoying, where that exact plotline had gone off in Chapter 1. Mage noble logic was pretty out there, so it was possible that his fellow mage nobles would immediately understand he'd been ring grandpa'd and spirit rooted to sudden victory, but it was also very possible that they'd have the much more reasonable what the fuck happened to you reaction, to which he had no answer except to bullshit as hard as he could. What do those protagonists usually do when their old friends confront them? Rhys pondered for a while, but all he could come up with was, deliver a sound face slapping, which he was pretty sure wouldn't fly in reality the same way it flew in trash novels. I'll workshop it. Surely he could come up with something better. In any case, he was just going on a little stroll today. He wasn't likely to encounter anyone Norton knew, or even anyone at all. There was no purpose to his walk except to take a stroll around town, so there shouldn't be anyone who encountered him. He sighed and put his head in his hands. What is it? Dar, M. Masterling. Lily stammered. Dar Masterling. Couldn't decide between darling and master, so he went for both. Rhys waved his hand. It's nothing. I just realized I jinxed myself, and I'm regretting it before it even happens. Oh. He took a deep breath and stood. The past was in the past, so he might as well stride forth and meet whatever horrible encounter awaited him. He flicked his fingers, casually ensconcing them in a tight-knit orb of impurities. It was a play on the silence barrier he'd seen Madame Tunk do earlier, but trash style. Unlike a neatly woven spell, his was just the high-static low-resolution mode from the smoking room, but dialed all the way up to opaque. It felt less cool doing it manually like this, but then, who knew? Maybe Madame Tunk's neat barrier also felt manual and uncool from the inside. He glanced down at Lily. While we're in public, it's darling, please. Or whatever you usually call me. Yes, darl, she froze, and a look of terror crossed her face. If it's derogative, that's fine too. I'm not going to take offense. But I am trying to rehabilitate my image, so I'd appreciate if it wasn't too brutal. He waved his hand again, retracting the impurities. Lily nodded. She straightened her spine and stood up sharply beside him. As you wish. And don't be so stiff. I'm not someone worth being afraid of. She looked at him, then at her feet, then back at him, confusion and terror blending on her face. Rhys opened his mouth to comment on it, then closed it. The more I say to her, the more awkwardly she's going to act. The best thing I can do right now is keep my mouth shut and just let her relax into her natural self. He walked down the street, and Lily followed, close at his heel. As he walked, he sprinkled little plant 2s along the path behind him, targeting the exact part of sidewalk he'd seen Ernesto walk previously. That was the entire point of this walk, and now that he'd done it, his objective was accomplished. But if he went inside after casually walking a 10-foot stretch of sidewalk just outside his house, people would start wondering why he'd walked that specific stretch, they'd ask questions, and it would just be really suspicious. So, instead, he offered his arm to Lily, and the two of them set off for the shopping district. To be completely fair, he did need new clothes. He'd had a look at Norton's closet, and the man's taste in clothes lined up with who he was as a human being. Gaudy colors, shiny silks, lush velvets, and generally over-the-top and flamboyant outfits that would make him stand out at a ball in a bad way. He wanted a subtly attractive outfit, something he could wear at the ball that could completely blend into the background, but also was impressive enough to draw the eye when he needed it to. Something subdued, yet lavish, quiet luxury, not leisure suit. This was a chore that he needed to do, eventually. Sure, he could have not done it personally, sent the maid out with an order, but 1, he wasn't sure how the maid would interpret that, 2, he didn't necessarily want poison-lined clothes, and 3, it just seemed like a really complicated social scenario that would be much easier accomplished, and involve less playing telephone, if he just went and bought some clothes himself. Of course, he probably would have just used the maid and suffered through the telephone game if he hadn't had a secondary motive, but here he was. We're going shopping? Lily asked, a few minutes into their leisurely journey. I need new robes, Rhys said evenly. Lily hesitated. The estate can't afford any more new robes. Your mother said so, remember? Ah, that's fine. I have alternative streams of income. I'll fund them myself. Are you sure? Rhys looked at her. How crazy expensive are these robes? Alternative question. How poor is the estate? Yeah, she gulped, then nodded. Okay. Worst case, I'll purchase raw fabric and sew my own robes. Back home in his world, that would be more expensive than just buying pre-built clothes, thanks to fast fashion and the slush that was the fast fashion industry. But here, that would be cheaper, plus, he'd be able to invest his own mana and personally shape the defenses on the robes. Not that he intended to wear his super expensive formal ball robes everywhere, if nothing else, he just wasn't that interested in attracting muggers. Which was why he'd prefer to invest less time and let someone else build the robes. He didn't care that much about defenses, since these weren't fighting clothes. Worst case, he'd wear his trash gear underneath and use their defenses if he needed to, or hot swap robes right before battle. If he was going to make them himself, then naturally he'd build defenses into them, but he didn't need defenses so badly that he'd worry about it and avoid pre-built clothes on account of defenses. You can do that? Lily asked, shocked. Yeah, you can too. I mean, you know how to do that. Rhys nodded. It's a hobby of mine. You didn't know. She shook her head. We still have so much to learn about each other. Rhys smiled at her. She cautiously smiled back. I feel like I'm dealing with a small animal that's totally traumatized toward humans, like a sugar glider or something that only has fear responses to human contact. He sighed internally and walked on. He was sure some men would find it adorable, but it was just annoying to him. It felt like he was walking a tightrope, where any overlarge gesture or slightly mindless comment would cause her to totally freak out. To her credit, the most she'd probably actually do was go stiff and give him that petrified look, but he was kind of tired of it. Honestly, it made him feel like a wife beater, even though he hadn't beaten her at all. It was that kind of guilt and self-disgust, except he hadn't actually done anything, which made it frustrating on top of feeling awful. The longer I spend with Lily, the less attracted I am to her. This isn't how trashy romances about two people forced to live together are supposed to go, he thought, and chuckled to himself. Sometimes, people were just incompatible, and he and Lily clearly fell into that bucket. No matter how long they spent around one another, there was just no spark of connection between them. The more time they spent around one another, the more they'd end up disliking one another, until it turned to hatred. When he was a kid, he'd say things like, hatred and love are the same emotion, just flipped. If you deeply hate, that's close to deeply loving someone. As an adult, though, he understood that hatred and love were not the same emotion at all. There were coworkers he deeply, earnestly despised, whom he would be happiest if he never had to interact with them again in his life, and whom he was very glad were now in an entirely different universe from him, so that he didn't even stand a ghost of a chance of interacting with them. There was no, extreme emotion, and fixation can work either way, there was only disgust and revulsion. In fact, rather than fixating on them, he would prefer to never think about them ever again, if it was at all possible. And it was fantastic that it was now very, very possible. He didn't feel that way toward Lily, but he certainly didn't feel anything like love toward her, either, or the kind of hatred-based fixation that turned into love in the trashy romances that had occasionally been a guilty pleasure for him back home. He felt neutral, leaning negative, and he'd be quite happy when he no longer had to pretend to be her anything, let alone her husband. They arrived at the shopping district without incident. Wandering around the district itself, Rhys kept his head on a swivel, but he didn't see anyone troublesome. He glanced at Lily. Who's the best tailor in this district? Your favorite is. Rhys raised his hand. I'm not asking for my favorite. I'm asking which one you honestly think is the best. Lily blushed. She hesitated for a moment, flustered, then pointed. That one. Rhys nodded his thanks and headed over, though internally, he couldn't help but track her reaction. She isn't attracted to me, is she? That would be problematic. Their trip to the tailor itself was largely uneventful. As he expected, Lily's taste was far more refined than her husband's had been, which was the whole reason he'd asked for her recommendation, not some kind of soft-heartedness on his part, and he easily acquired a set of quiet luxury-style robes for daily wear, as well as a more elegant yet restrained set for going to balls. Neither set would be finished today. The tailor merely took his measure and cut the roughs, but the actual clothing wouldn't be done for a few days, which was within his expectations. Greatly pleased with the visit, Rhys stepped out of the shop to head home. Well, if it isn't Norton. Where have you been lately? An arm slung around his shoulders, and the sickly sweet scent of alcohol, mixed with the sharp herbal scent of this world's drugs, encased him. Rhys stiffened, pressing his lips together. Damn it. Just when I thought I might have escaped the jinx, there it is. He turned his head away from the unwelcome interloper, repressing the urge to sigh. He had jinxed himself. That much was undeniably true. Still, he'd started to wonder if maybe for once the world was going to let him get away with it. Maybe the world was a kind and loving place, and he wouldn't have to watch out for it to whip around and get him the second he lowered his guard. Maybe he'd done good things lately, and his good deeds had negated the mistake he'd made by putting that out into the world and jinxing himself. No, was the answer. A swift and very clear no. No, he would be punished the way he deserved to be, for daring to spit into the wind the way he had. Well, to be fair, I haven't exactly done good deeds lately, Rhys thought, thinking back on his recent acts. Killing a man and replacing him wasn't exactly A+ morality material. And before that, he hadn't been thinking of it as his villain arc, for nothing. Though honestly, it was kind of a mid-ass villain arc. He could go way harder than that. He hadn't even committed large-scale mass murder or anything yet. I probably shouldn't, though. No one liked a murder hobo. It would have to be justified large-scale mass murder. Joking aside, he quietly scanned the man beside him. Tier 2, so no threat whatsoever, but his friendly attitude meant he was a high risk of identifying Rhys as not Norton, even if Rhys successfully sold his complete and total change of heart. There were some things that always remained the same, no matter how much the person changed. Mannerisms and motions, turns of phrase, even the way they made expressions. Sure, he'd watched Norton before taking his place, but he hadn't spent weeks watching every tiny twitch and shift of the man's face. He'd spent weeks watching the man writ large, from afar. He made a passable Norton, but he wasn't going to win any little humanoid metal statuettes for his performance. I guess I could just lure him back to my house and kill him, though that's definitely a last resort. If everyone who'd known Norton went missing, people would eventually put 2 and 2 together and finger Norton as suspicious. He needed to be Norton for another week or two until ball season kicked off. That was plenty of time for people to realize that all of Norton's friends had been disappearing, one by one. Then again, if everyone had the same attitude as Madame Tunk, maybe they wouldn't mind so much. He'd been watching Norton Tunk for long enough to know that neither him, nor his friends, were particularly popular. Mage Noble standards were strange. Rather than trying to hunt him down for killing because murder was wrong, they might, instead, appreciate him for taking out the trash. Taking out the trash, Rhys's eyes lit up. Hold up, now. It did rely on noble mage logic, which was exactly what he said he shouldn't rely on until he understood it, but on the other hand, as long as Madame Tunk was a pretty normal mage noble, wasn't he perfectly fine? He benefited the mage nobles and society writ large by quietly removing a small population of undesirables. He was pretty sure they wouldn't be happy if he openly killed them, but if he quietly killed them off out of sight of the world, the nobles would probably go along with it, or at least, weren't likely to directly protest it to his face. It would attract attention. That was the main problem. He needed to be stealthy, or at least blend in, right now. Going around as a serial killer / vigilante for kind of shitty, useless noble brats wasn't going to help him blend in. Just because the nobles might overlook it, and it is, might, he reminded himself, didn't mean they wouldn't notice, and the last thing he needed was their attention. Still, he looked at the man who'd slung an arm over his shoulder. If push came to shove, killing him was probably on the menu. The man blinked back at him. What's that look for? What? Don't go to the pub for a week, and you've already forgotten your old friend Jory. Rhys squinted at him. Who are you? Jory laughed. He slapped Rhys's back. Yeah, you out with the broad. More like she's out with me, Rhys returned. He was the one who was shopping, after all. Lily was just along for the ride. How about we ditch her and hit up the pleasure district instead? Jory suggested. What, just you and me? I call top, Rhys thought to himself, but managed to restrain his urge to joke at the last second. This wasn't Norton's awakening as a B-tier comedian, it was his awakening as a good husband and all-around nice guy who didn't drink all day or spend all his nights in brothels. He lifted his hand instead, putting his palm out flat toward Jory. No, thank you. I've sworn off all that. Jory blinked at him. Huh, no way. Hello, who's in there? Am I speaking to Norton Tunk? Rhys sighed dramatically. I'm sorry, Jory. It's just that I've had an awakening. I realized how tragic it was to waste my life away being a layabout. I want to make something of myself. I want to be a good husband and a good son. I can't spend all day with you anymore. Jory frowned, his frown slowly deepening. Hold up. Did you call me a layabout? Isn't that what you are? Rhys asked domineeringly. If he was going to pull holier than thou, he might as well go all the way. He was born again today, with all the evangelizing, annoying aura that came along with it. Put a name tag on me and hand me a mini book, because I'm a good little boy from here on out. Although, honestly, the name tag wearers weren't that bad. It was the non-name tag wearers who were the worst, who looked like normal people, but then they'd ambush him with judgment when he was just trying to live a quiet trashy life. Yeah, he knew his life choices could be better, but he didn't ask them about it. They just came up to him and gave him their opinions anyways. Besides, who made them gods of morality? They'd all made mistakes in their lives at some point. Hell, telling him that he'd messed up was messing up according to their own code, not that they cared. Jory looked at him, then exerted his aura, suddenly bursting to a high tier 2 level. Lily paled beside him, but Rhys lifted his hand and blocked the aura from reaching her, and her color returned. Jory scowled fiercely, somehow unaware of how unfazed Rhys was. Yeah, you want to say that again? Rhys squinted at him, then realized, this man was probably stronger than Norton. It was a close thing, so close that he wasn't sure he'd have been able to tell the difference between the two of them unless they were standing right next to each other, but he was stronger. It was like the difference in strength between an ant and a soldier ant. Sure, to an ant, the soldier ant was a big deal, but to a human, they couldn't even tell the difference unless they looked closely. As it was, his threat was laughable. For a second, Rhys considered playing along and acting weak, but then he dismissed the idea. He'd already said he'd quit being a layabout and had an awakening. Why didn't he show Jory the extent of his awakening? He took a moment to carefully adjust his trash star down to the lowest possible tier 3 burn he could, then exerted a tiny fraction of that pressure on Jory. Like that, it would probably feel like a very high tier 2 aura. Jory paled. He stumbled back, looking up at Rhys in shock, and Rhys licked his lips a little. Whoops, I might have overshot tier 2. Oh well. How? Jory asked. Rhys drew himself up to his full height. He pushed Jory away, casually slipping a plan 2 into his pocket as he pushed the man away. Like I said, I stopped slacking off and took my life and magehood seriously. You should try it. Flipping his hair, he walked off, and Lily hurried after him. At the very least, my shockingly higher tier should distract him from any micro-discrepancies in my Norton Tunk act, Rhys considered. Of course, on the other hand, Madame Tunk had been a high-ranking noble as a tier 3. A high tier 3, whereas he couldn't have exerted more than a low tier 3 aura himself, but still, tier 3 meant something in the alliance. The power scaling here was low, even lower than the Empire, with most of the higher tier mages concentrated into a small pocket of 4 or 5 people, so even a low tier 3 was a serious threat around this place. He truly might have overplayed his hand by not making the effort to lower his core all the way to 2. It was just that it was so annoying to burn it that cold, and the thing was constantly burning at full power right now, given the massive quantities of impurities he'd been encountering lately, so he hadn't wanted to kill it that hard, even for a moment. Jory stared after him until he passed out of sight. Only then did Lily turn to him. Was that okay? He's your friend. Was my friend, Rhys emphasized, putting an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close to indicate to anyone who might be watching them that Lily was the reason he'd separated from Jory's crowd. It wasn't true, but it was a convenient untruth. Oh, Lily murmured, and Rhys looked at her, startled. She didn't believe him, did she? That'd be the most troublesome thing of all. Lily was lost in her own world, her head tilted down, a hand to her mouth. There wasn't a chance to make eye contact and shake his head. Rhys sighed silently to himself, suddenly feeling like he was the bad guy in a cheap rom-com. Honestly, all I need to do is set her up with someone and find someone to fall in love with myself, and we're all set. But Mouse was busy and Lily was married and not looking, so much for that. Though, he supposed, to be specific, Lily was a widow. She just didn't know it yet. Or maybe strongly suspected it. One way or another, he didn't think she cared, or would cry when she found out the truth. Do you want to go to a cafe, or anything? Lily offered. Rhys shook his head. No, I'd rather head back home. That was enough outing for one day, and he was exhausted. He didn't want to have to deal with any more of Norton's friends. Lily nodded, though she looked a little disappointed. You can go to a cafe, he suggested. She didn't need his permission or supervision to go. She shook her head. I can't go alone. Rhys squinted at her. Yes, you can. It's a little awkward, but it's totally possible. Hey, you just shat on all the single dogs in the world. Apologize to all the people who can't find a partner, Lily. There's thousands of people who don't have anyone else to go to cafes with, okay. They just have to grit their teeth and go alone. By saying you won't do it, are you saying you're better than every single person in the world, huh? What? Rhys sighed. Perfect husbands don't rant at their wives about random bullshit. They bottle it up and loose it on their coworkers instead. Nothing. He paused. You can go alone. There's nothing stopping you from doing whatever you want, on your own time. You have that power. She stared at him like he'd just suggested she stand on her head. That's never been true. It's always been true. You've just been brainwashed by noble society to think it isn't. Challenge the mental barriers you've been living according to, and I think you'll find they're far more flexible than you assume. Rhys shook his head and kept walking, but behind him, Lily stopped dead. She stared at the ground, her brows furrowing, then looked up slowly, shocked. Her mana shuddered as an epiphany rocked through her. Her lips moved as she spoke to herself, and then she shook her head and dashed after him. He was practicing in the smoking room when it happened. Rhys jolted out of his meditation and jumped to his feet, holding his breath and watching with the very tail of his mana senses. Although he called it the limit of his mana senses, it wasn't the true limit of his mana senses, which at this point was rather absurd. It was the limit of his resting mana senses, which was less absurd and more similar to the range of normal mages, mana senses. Ernesto walked by, directly through the path of Plan 2's Rhys had set. He held his breath, watching, and saw the sticky tack he'd created to mimic chewed and discarded gum do its job. He'd had to teleport out of the city to make it happen, since the closest thing he could think of to gum was tree sap, but he'd made it happen with a few quick trashcan teleports. It had done its job so well that he'd worried the Plan 2 wouldn't survive until Ernesto showed up, what with all the mages tracking it all over the city, but enough had survived that he could track one moving with Ernesto, stuck to the heel of his boot. He breathed out. And that's part 2 of Plan 2, right on schedule. The first party of ball season wasn't until the end of the week, but he wasn't waiting for the end of the week to start Plan 2. All his plans were running concurrently, even the ones he hadn't come up with yet. Part of Plan 2 was to sprinkle a little preparation all over the city, so that if he came up with a Plan 3 or 4 that required maneuverability and flexibility, he'd already laid the bones to execute on it later. The most important part of preparation was to make backups and prepare for the unexpected. Plans didn't always go perfectly, especially not in one of his favorite trash TV genres, baking shows. The number of times he'd seen a baker make exactly 3 cupcakes when they needed exactly 3 cupcakes was too damn high. Make some backups. Make 6, or even a dozen cupcakes. That way, if something went wrong, there was something to pivot to. Or so he ranted at the television, knowing nothing about baking, let alone competitive baking. At the end of the day, he was just trash. But because he was the kind of trash who ranted helplessly at poor pressurized show contestants who were already hanging by a thread from stress just from being televised and judged on national television, he knew that he absolutely refused to fail because he hadn't prepared a backup. He wouldn't be the one who went home in the first round because one of his cookies broke and he had to serve the judges a broken cookie, no siree. The real problem was that there were a lot of moving parts and uncertainties in the plans he'd made. He didn't know a lot of information that was vital to his objectives of rescuing Straw and Soma, clearing the marks from Bast and the Sword Saint, and overthrowing Virgil. If he didn't have wiggle room in a plan with that much unknown in it, he was really just shooting himself in the foot. Now that he'd gotten a plan 2 on Ernesto, the most important part of the pre-action plan could begin. His eyes flashed, and he lowered his head. Now that I've succeeded, it's time to reveal. My plan 2, all along, was just a miniaturized version of the disposable trash hoops from the Arctic area. They're one use only, but as long as I have one and the mage doesn't notice it, I've essentially snuck a mini camera into wherever I need to know about. He could extend his mana senses through the hoop, into the void, and out through any of the mini hoops. If he really wanted to, he could physically go to the void and peer through the hoop, though he'd have to move the exit point of the mini hoop to the island first, or else he'd be risking his life for a little voyeurism, what with Void Beast wandering around. And he wasn't a voyeur, either, so he wouldn't even enjoy it, so what was the point? No, until he absolutely needed his eyeballs, he was going to stick with using his mana senses, which could extend arbitrarily around corners and through narrow holes. He paused as his mind went to a horrible place. If that's the case, doesn't that mean that common decency is all that's between us and constant underclothes X-ray vision, Arrow manga style? I have common decency, and most people I know have common decency, but not all people I know. A certain oversexed filth construct came to mind, and Rhys pursed his lips. Yeah, I think we can all just assume that Soma's looking at us naked all the time. But then again, maybe not. He does seem to like the thrill of the chase. I should ask him, the next time no, wait. Do I want to know? Yeah, amend that. I should definitely not ask him. Ever. If he wants to see my hog, that's his call. I can just let that be one of life's great mysteries for me. He sat back down in the smoking room with a big hoop in front of him and waited, giving Ernesto time to get to wherever he was going. 20 minutes later, he checked in. Ernesto was wandering the shopping district, looking at household goods. Not interesting. He went back to practicing and waited another 20 minutes before checking in again. Ernesto was having a nice cup of tea at a cafe, sipping it and chatting with some other mage. Still not interesting. Rhys popped out again, waiting half an hour this time. Ernesto was eating dinner, taking his time and enjoying his meal. Rhys put his head in his hands. What was this? He felt like Ernesto was trolling him, except he was pretty sure the now weaker mage wouldn't notice his loop. Just go. Just go do the thing you're supposed to do. Go visit your lab. Come on. He checked in a few more times that night, but Ernesto continued to have a nice evening out on town, then stumbled home to his house and slept the night away. Meanwhile, Rhys sat in the smoking room, sweating over having to check so many times and risk detection repeatedly, having the opposite of a nice night out. Instead, he was having a stressful night in. He's got to go to work in the morning, right? Right. It's not a weekend tomorrow, is it? Did mages even work a 5-day workweek? It wasn't like they lived in a capitalist society. They didn't need to work 40-hour weeks or anything like that. None of those weird artificial constructs had been created here yet. Who knew when Ernesto worked? He could work midnights, or only Tuesdays, or whenever the mood struck him. Sure, the academy had operated on a 5 days on, 2 days off schedule, or had seemed to, anyways, since Rhys was the original truant, and had never attended class seriously at any academy, but he didn't know if anything else operated on that schedule, or if there was a concept of operating on a schedule, even. He sighed and laid backward, sprawling out in the smoking room on the filthy floor. He'd never wanted a rat race shitty 5-day work week so bad as he wanted it right now. What if Ernesto worked when he felt like it, and when he felt like it was once every 6 months, or something? He'd certainly been in the situation where he didn't want to work for 6 straight months. He wasn't allowed to not work for 6 straight months without getting fired and subsequently starving to death, but he hadn't wanted to work. No, surely not. Soma had just been captured, and where else would they send him but Ernesto's lab? Surely he'd be deeply interested in investigating Soma. Or was he not interested in remnant weapons, just in curse energy? Come to think of it, he had been researching cursed energy back at Purple Dawn, not remnant weapons. It just so happened that straw was a great and powerful collection of cursed energy that was obviously valuable to a cursed energy researcher, whether or not said researcher was also interested in remnant weapons. Soma, on the other hand, was just filth. He didn't have any particular repository of or ability to use cursed energy, any more than filth was naturally inclined toward cursed energy. Plus, Virgil had said he was going to torture Soma. Rhys still wasn't that worried about Soma getting tortured, except that he was kind of worried about opening any more doors for Soma, but still, he probably hadn't sent Soma to Ernesto if he was going to torture him. He'd probably locked Soma in a dank, dark dungeon, deep under his palace, where the sun never shone. I really hope those torturers are alright. Then again, if Virgil understood Soma, which Rhys doubted, but who knew, maybe he had sent Soma to Ernesto. It was the driest and least sexy thing Rhys could think of to get actually examined in a real research lab. Although he was well aware that sexy researchers in sexy fantasy labs were a pretty common fetish, actual research labs were boring as hell. They were dry, sad spaces where doctoral students sat around all day, worked to the bone and underpaid, with little visual stimulus or conversation because everyone was too socially stunted to communicate with one another. Nothing sexual or sexy happened in them. The doctoral students were too busy grinding away at their next paper to have any fun. Then again, this was a fantasy world, so maybe sexy things did happen in research labs. He didn't know. If Soma had been sent to Ernesto's lab, Rhys was 100% sure he was going to be trying to make things happen. It was just that he'd be fighting an uphill battle if it was anything like the research labs Rhys was used to. He laid on the floor of the smoking room, completely listless, and waited for Ernesto to go to work. A day passed, and another day, until at last Rhys peeked in and found himself looking at that inverted pyramid at the top of the town from close under its tip. Instantly, he sat upright, all his focus on the loop. He watched for just long enough to confirm that Ernesto was actually heading toward it, not just walking around it, then vanished again, completely retracting his mana senses, and waited just a little longer. Just a little longer, so that Ernesto could get past whatever passed as security and ensconce himself in the lab. Every part of him longed to check, his impatience burning in his fingertips, but he refused to touch the loop and allow himself to peek. Not yet. Now was the most critical moment, the moment when he absolutely could not check, no matter what. Just a little more, a few more minutes. I can't wait any longer. He jumped forward and touched the loop, extending his mana senses through it again. A shiny white hallway. A view down into the city through the slanted glass beside him. He was inside the pyramid. Inside the center of government. He'd done it, but I'm not done yet. He took a deep breath and retracted his senses again. He was inside, but he wasn't in the lab yet. He shouldn't count his chickens before they'd hatched. He was so close. Closer to Straw than he'd been since he was a child. But if he moved now, he'd lose everything. For just a few more seconds, he had to press on. I'm coming, Straw. Finally, after all these years, I'm finally almost there. Rhys held his breath. He counted slowly, from 0 to 60, then back to 0. Repeating that 3 more times, he finally pushed another scrap of mana into the loop and peered out into wherever Ernesto stood. And there he was, in the depths of Ernesto's lab. Even without paying close attention to where he was, without being able to see it, and without exploring it with his mana senses, he knew it was Ernesto's lab. The cursed energy was so thick here that he could almost taste it, even at a glimpse from his mana senses alone. There was nowhere in the Alliance that had such thick cursed energy, and no one who'd be allowed in its headquarters with such thick cursed energy, except for Ernesto's lab and Ernesto. It was also familiar. Painfully so. This was Straw's energy, without a single scrap of doubt. It might have been years since he'd last felt it, but that didn't mean he couldn't recognize it. The second he felt it, he was instantly transported back to his second childhood, to that moment when the Alliance had so rudely ripped Straw away from him. Straw, and Bast, too. If he knew then what he knew now, he would have never let the Sword Saint take Bast. Regrets didn't help him accomplish anything. He was here to right what had gone wrong, not to live looking backward. It was possible for him to see the room by sending thicker mana senses through the tiny hoop to survey things. In fact, that was how mana senses usually functioned. Even throughout the day, he'd been peeking in with that level of mana senses to see how things were going. But that had been outside, when Ernesto would be surrounded by all kinds of foreign mana senses, and it wouldn't be too strange for a random unknown person's mana senses to sweep by him momentarily. Now, though, they were in Ernesto's lab. Rhys didn't know how well shielded the lab was, but given that it was in the center of the strongest gathering of mages in the area, aka the nobles, quarters in the Alliance's capital, he had to assume it was well shielded to prevent the mage nobles from noticing his cursed energy research. So after he sent the tiniest probe in to check that he was in the right place, he shocked the hoop with a tiny zap of mana to free it from Ernesto's shoe, then withdrew all his senses and let it lie there silently. He could jump in now, but that was the equivalent of blasting and guns blazing. He wanted to see how things were going as subtly as possible, keeping all his options open, including retreating entirely to wait for a better time to attack. Now wasn't the time to go loud. Now was just a scouting run. Once he'd scouted, gotten the lay of the land, and knew how everything was situated, then it was time to make a move. A little tap at his elbow startled him. He looked down to find the tiny straw doll from his sword standing by his arm, its head tilted, button eyes staring directly at him. Rhys gave it a comforting pat and put it on his shoulder. Soon, boy. Not yet, but soon. The little doll trilled in dissatisfaction, but settled in to wait alongside Rhys. He'd already known it, but that only confirmed what he knew, that the cursed energy definitely belonged to Straw. The doll had never reacted this way to cursed energy before, but it was a part of Straw. If it was reacting, then it had to be Straw. Armed with this knowledge, Rhys waited. And waited. And waited some more. Day turned into night. He was tempted to check and see if Ernesto was still in the lab, but he held off. He still had the scattered plan 2S. If Ernesto left, he'd be able to sense the man along his route home. It was safer to wait and sense him outside the lab, rather than try to peer in on him in the lab, which might be a relatively sterile space where his mana senses were easy to notice. One quick glimpse, restricted to the most basic level, probably wasn't that bad. Ernesto was likely to overlook it or dismiss it, but if he peeked in twice or 3 times, he'd create a pattern that Ernesto might notice or at least lock onto. It was safest to wait, and after all this time, it wasn't like rescuing Straw was urgent. He could wait. I can wait. Patience, Rhys. It's a virtue, he repeated to himself, rolling around on the floor of the smoking room out of boredom. Somehow, he'd ended up with the rawest end of the stick, here. This was the part that those action movies with the catchy theme song about impossible missions never showed. The lounging around and being bored for hours, if not days, while waiting for the perfect conditions to materialize. The straw doll laid down on the ground beside him and rolled around too, chirping in enjoyment. Rhys looked at it, then laughed and went back to rolling. If Mini Straw was having fun, then he could keep rolling around a little. Upstairs, Lily paused. She looked down. Her mana senses were weak, but she was pretty close to the smoking room, and, was he really rolling around on the floor? That terrifying expert that even Madame Tunk was afraid of, was rolling around on the ground like a 3-year-old. Who was she to judge? Maybe the secret to his power was rolling around on the ground. She looked at her hands, then the floor. Should she? Back in the smoking room, Rhys stopped rolling around and sat up. He was here for a long time, not a good time, so he might as well lock in and start focusing on practice instead of rolling around on the floor like a useless blob. He could easily monitor the hoops at a low-level rate while he practiced, and if he got enlightened and was too busy to monitor the hoops, then he'd have gained more via enlightenment than he would have through monitoring the hoops. It was a win-win situation, where he benefited either way. He sat there, and sat, and sat. His villain arc involved a lot more sitting around than he expected, but then, it was largely successful. A lot of villains failed for moving too quickly, his long enough theory. He wasn't going to be one of them. But that did mean a lot more doing nothing than he'd foreseen for his villain arc. I thought my villain arc would involve a lot more blood. And there's been plenty of blood, but honestly, I think I've been killing fewer people since I initiated my formal villain arc. Maybe I should go back and start killing more. Though, on the other hand, he still had plenty of time. There were still a few big events to come. He could still spill plenty of blood. Still, he wasn't sure he'd beat his body count during his revolutionary turn in the Empire. It's fine. I don't have to constantly kill more people. It's not necessary to escalate body count every time I accomplish a new objective. In fact, actually, it's better if I don't escalate that. Still, it is kind of funny that I killed a lot more people as a hero than a villain. The straw doll hopped on his shoulder and settled into a cross-legged sit as well. The two of them sat quietly, waiting, watching, until abruptly, the straw doll leapt up. Rhys opened his eyes as well, leaning forward. Ernesto was out on the town. He'd left the lab. It was go time. He quietly extended his senses through first, examining the space on the far side of the hoop and confirming that there was no one there. When he sensed no one, he hopped into the hoop, through the void, and out the other hoop on the other side. Stepping through the hoop was an interesting experience, because unlike all the other teleport points he'd made, this one was far too small for him to actually step through. Instead, he kind of leaned into it, then let the interdimensional travel do its thing and suck him through. Right from the start, when he'd been hopping in and out of the void, he had been using tiny holes in the baskets of the trash can, but he still stepped into the trash can. Now, he was simply using the tiny hole property, but only executing the tiny hole part, as opposed to building a larger armature around it. It was something he'd always been able to do, since the interdimensional travel part was always more of a shifting in one's reality than a literal step, but he'd simply never implemented the full form of it until now. He stepped out into a dark room. The walls were stone, like a dungeon, and like a dungeon, steel manacles hung from the wall, oozing dangerous enchantments that wanted nothing more than to hold and never let go. They weren't enclosing anything right now, though, because his target, and the reason Ernesto was here, laid in a shapeless pile on the floor, caged in by a magic circle, straw. His aura was unmistakable, but right now, he didn't look like much at all, just a lump of, well, straw. It wasn't in the shape of a doll at all, but just randomly strewn wheatgrass, all lying in a jumble. Rhys crouched just outside the circle. He already knew he wouldn't be able to communicate with straw like this, and it wasn't like he could free straw, either, until it was time to go loud, since freeing him would alert everyone, but he had to get a look at how straw was imprisoned. He lifted his hand, pressing it outward until it touched the exterior of the barrier that extended upward from the circle. The barrier enclosed the area that held straw, as well as the air for about 3 feet up, then curved back down in a dome. Experimentally, he pushed impurities into it. The barrier instantly fought back, continuously refreshed by a source of purity in the floor. Rhys retracted his hand, surprised. They had anti-impurity provisions. That was not surprising at all, actually. It made perfect sense. Otherwise, how would they imprison Soma? True, he'd probably let them imprison him, but someone like Virgil, who put marks on even his most trusted men, didn't just overlook problems like Soma. No, he was the sort to make backups to his backups, and clearly this barrier was engineered to stand up to cursed energy. Made sense. It was caging Straw, who was a giant cursed energy sponge in his own creator's words, and to filth, in case they needed to cage Soma. In any case, it meant that his usual go-tos wouldn't be guarantees anymore. He had to prepare for someone who was prepared for him. I need a new barrier-breaking technique, or at least something that'll let me get through this. He touched the ground, then raised his brows. The barrier was resistant to impurities, but the barrier was etched on the ground. Was the ground resistant, as well? Experimentally, he injected impurities into the stone floor. The stones were high-class magical artifacts in their own right, and they stood up to far more impurities than Rhys expected them to. But a few moments, and tiny, hairline cracks appeared in their surface. He instantly retracted his impurities, then used his strength to grind down the stones and erase the signs of his tampering. It was an option to cut the floor out with his impurities, grab the barrier wholesale, and figure out a way to break it later. Overwhelming force, he thought, then laughed. Where would he even find that? Well, no. Actually, that was an option. I'll keep that one in my back pocket. That's a last-ditch effort. Let's keep working on figuring out a new barrier-breaking attack first, and if I can't figure one out, then we go with that. That's the nuclear option. I'm coming, Straw. I haven't forgotten you, he promised at a whisper. To his surprise, the straw in the circle stirred. Rhys put his hand against the barrier. A lump of straw rose up, forming the shape of a hand, then pressed against his in return. He remained crouched there for a moment, then lowered his hand. Now wasn't the time. But he had valuable information, and the first of many teleportation points in place. I've done all the setup I can. I know everything I need to know. It's time to move on. There's more plans to orchestrate, and more moving parts to get locked down. With a last glance at Straw, Rhys hopped back into the hoop and vanished. Behind him in the lab, a slender figure shifted in the shadows. Back in the smoking room, Rhys paused for a moment, temporarily too overcome by emotion to act rationally. He wanted to jump back in and rescue Straw now, and plans be damned, but no. No, he couldn't. If he did that, he threw all the rest of it into chaos. This only went off if he got everything together, all ready to execute at the same time. Even a single flinch, a single move too early, and it all fell apart. He took a deep breath, then settled himself. Step 1, done. On to step 2. Straw was taken care of. Mouse, Lyra, and Bast remained. Of the three, Lyra was the one he was least worried about. Yes, the enemy was using her face. However, he suspected that they were able to use her face because Lyra was no longer using it. Just because they were using Lyra's face was no guarantee that Lyra was in danger. She was a shapeshifter. She had 70% more of the world available to her, as a water-based lifeform, assuming that 70% of this world is water. If he was her, he'd be miles away right now, hidden in the deep ocean or some far-flung lake with a new face, harassing a new set of land-bound friends. If he never saw her again, he honestly wouldn't be too worried. Sure, he'd have that tang of anxiety at the back of his mind of a thread cast loose, but he was pretty sure that it was no more than that. She could take care of herself. She was fine. Mouse was actively in the enemy's grasp. As concerned as he was about that, it wasn't as if she was in imminent bodily danger. She was the enemy. He was pretty sure the enemy either didn't know that there was a bit of energy between them, or that the enemy assumed it was merely an act to get his sympathy. Rhys was pretty sure it wasn't an act, but hell, he was trash. Maybe it was. Either way, he wasn't going to move for Mouse first, because she was currently safe. Bast was on the enemy's side too, but more tenuously. He wasn't the enemy's trusted spy, he was the underling of the man the enemy had forced, via contractual obligation, to be on the enemy's side, who was also induced to loyalty via magical contract. That was the kind of tenuous obligation that meant any wrong move on his part might lead to him being in real bodily danger. And when Rhys was planning to do big money moves pretty soon, which might force Bast into a place where he might have to violate his contract or violate his personal values and desires in order to survive, he had to make sure he put Bast in a good place to be able to maneuver around Virgil, without forcing him to obey a contract he didn't want to and therefore fight Rhys. Unfortunately, Virgil had found out about his mark breaking, which meant he'd likely suspect Bast, even if Bast had a fully functional mark, let alone if Rhys actually broke the mark. He had to break the mark in the seconds before he made his move, or risk Virgil remarking him. However, if he waited until the last second to break the mark, he'd tip his hand, not to mention that getting that close to Bast in the first place was going to take non-zero time, and setting up the mark break, everything, that was what he had to do now. That was his next step. The timer was ticking down. His clothes were back from the tailor. There were days until the ball. He didn't have to attack at the first ball, but it would be the first opportunity to attack, and he wanted to provide himself with the most opportunities possible. At this point, he couldn't simply sit around anymore. He had to act, even if it was not long enough. A smile crept across his face. But that was fine, because he hadn't just been sitting around. He'd laid his plan to his tiny loops, all over the city. He knew the comings and goings of most of the capital's mage nobles. And he had clocked Bast and the Sword Saint moving around the capital. They didn't walk around often, instead preferring to remain locked up in the Sword Saint's private quarters in the inverted pyramid, which is probably Virgil's preference, if I had to guess, not Bast's or the Sword Saint's. When they left, they typically made a one-way journey to an apothecary in the shopping district, then stopped by a very specific restaurant on the way home. It was a pattern, and a pattern he was prepared to take advantage of. The big unknown was the Sword Saint. He knew nothing about the man. For all he knew, the guy was a loyalist who loved Virgil. It wasn't the vibe he'd gotten from their brief meeting in the Empire, no, that vibe was, a man under heavy mind control, but it could nonetheless be possible. Virgil was the kind of guy who wouldn't be satisfied until he had 100% control. Loyalty wasn't enough for him. He needed control. He was the exact kind of micromanaging shit boss who ruined projects by riding his underlings far too hard, who left them unable to actually accomplish the things they needed to because he was simply unable to trust them to do anything due to his own psychological hangups. He was no good as a leader, but he was a pain in Rhys's ass thanks to his shitty leadership making it harder for Rhys to work in the margins. Heckin' dictators. Rhys stood, dusting himself off. He emerged from the smoking room. Lily, let's get lunch. Yes, sir. Lily replied, hurrying down the stairs. The little straw doll chirped on his shoulder, excited. Rhys jumped, then grabbed the doll and stuffed it into his storage ring. Lily had been shockingly accommodating so far, but he was pretty sure cursed relics of a remnant weapon were a bridge too far. Maybe. Probably. He rounded the corner to meet Lily at the bottom of the stairs. There's no need to call me, sir. I'm your beloved husband, remember? Of course, sir. Husband. He sighed. At least call me Norton in public. Naturally, sir. Rhys looked at Lily, reconsidering taking her along with him, but ultimately turned and headed for the door. If he went to lunch alone, without a friend or anyone, people would look at him funny. He'd know. He'd done it enough in life one. Rhys didn't care, but when he was trying not to attract attention, it wasn't ideal. It also would harm his image as the suddenly rehabilitated perfect husband, since, after all, it would imply that he didn't want his beloved wife to come along to lunch with him. He didn't want to imply that, so better to bring her along, even if she might call him, sir, and confuse the waiters. Whatever. I can just imply that we're into roleplay or something. He headed out the door with Lily by his side. Rhys wanted to beeline directly to the restaurant, but that would be too obvious. Instead, he once again wandered the shopping district with Lily, then turned to her. "Should we grab lunch?" Ah, yes, of course. She chirped, quickly overcoming her initial confusion. Rhys offered his arm, and the two of them headed over to the restaurant that Bast and the Sword Saint frequented. Bast wasn't there yet, because that would have been too suspicious. Rhys and Lily were seated, and Rhys ordered some drinks and an appetizer. They'd be here for the long haul. He intended on savoring his food and drink over the course of the next few hours. It would be another hour to 3 hours before Bast arrived, if he arrived at all today. He should, but there were no guarantees when it came to people's schedules. Working a corporate job had taught him that if it had taught him anything. Still, Bast almost always came to this restaurant around this time on this day of the week. It would be a rare day that he skipped. Of course, I don't need to eat, so it shouldn't be hard to drag a meal out. He rested his hands on his lap and waited, prepared to sip and nibble like a true noble. The appetizer arrived, and Rhys's mouth started watering just from the scent alone. Melted cheese topped a rich bowl of onion soup, with a hearty bread meant to be eaten with it all. It took every scrap of his willpower not to jump atop the food and devour it whole. He lifted his spoon, and his hand shook. He wanted to scoop it all up in big hunks and shove it into his mouth, but he couldn't. He was here to stall for time. If he ate quickly, they'd kick him out just as quickly. Mage restaurants weren't like European restaurants, they didn't purchase the table as much as the food. They were here to eat, and when they were done, it was time to get the fuck out. He couldn't eat the soup like that, or else he'd have to keep buying more and more food until he was fat and bloated. Deep breaths. Play it cool. We can do this. Small bites. Rhys took a deep breath and dipped the spoon into the broth, just barely wetting the spoon with the liquid. He put it into his mouth. His eyes went wide. Rhys sucked quick breaths, struggling not to hyperventilate. Oh gods. It's good. It's better than I thought it would be. It's better than it smelled. I'm going to die. I'm going to overeat and die. S.N. Norton. Are you okay? Lily asked, leaning across the table in concern. I might die, Rhys confessed. It's that serious. Shocked, she jumped to her feet. Rhys grabbed her arm and gestured for her to sit back down before she could do anything drastic. Figure of speech. Maybe. Unless I actually try to eat as much of this as I want to, and then it might become literal. Her brows furrowed, but she sat back down. You were pale. I was worried. I was just taken aback by how delicious the soup is. Really? Madame Tunk says this place is a shithole that only lesser nobles bother with. Please excuse my language. Rhys coughed. Madame Tunk probably has higher standards than the garbage man. I have decided to appreciate the small things in life. And it's completely changed my perspective on many things. Of course, Lily said, quickly nodding along. In any case, this place seems well attended for well, you know what you called it. Lily looked around. It's because Luke Scion comes here. No one's here for the food. Heresy, Rhys silently interjected. They're all here to curry favor with the Sword Saint, and by extension, Virgil. Do people often succeed? Lily gave him a look as if he'd asked her if the sun was bright. Of course not. But that doesn't stop them from trying. It tracks, especially since I know he's under Virgil's mark, in some form of semi-mind control. Of course. Don't tell me, is that why? Rhys raised his hand. I'm here for the food, and the food alone. Like I said, I've decided to go back to the beginning and savor the little things in life. She gave him a suspicious look, but nodded slowly. After a second, she added, this place is notorious for not being particularly careful about cleanliness or herb preparation. People have gotten poisoned before. Oh, was that why it smelled so delicious? Rhys lowered his nose again, taking a second sniff. Now that he was focusing on it, it did have an ever so slightly off scent to it. For him, it was nothing but a flavor enhancer, but for everyone else, it would probably be off-putting. Lily, a member of the everyone else category, looked at him like he was crazy, and not for the first time. I didn't know my dear husband had such refined taste. Nor did I, but we all learned something about ourselves today. Rhys took another sip of his food poisoning soup. It wasn't his first time eating delicious food poisoning. Back home in his first world, one of his favorite takeout places had a 50-50 shot on poisoning him with one of his favorite dishes. He eventually had to stop ordering it for his own safety, but man, what delicious poison it had been. If only it hadn't been food poisoning, or if it had at least been milder than shit your brains out poisoning. Well, there was no point reminiscing about the past. Rhys finished his soup as slowly as he could manage, then glanced at Lily's untouched bowl. If you aren't interested, could I? Oh, of course. Lily pushed it toward him. Fantastic. Rhys exchanged his empty bowl with hers and started all over again. She stared at him in disbelief, then shook her head and turned away, choosing to say nothing. Rhys was halfway through his main dish when a ripple of attention ran through the restaurant, as every patron suddenly sat up a little straighter and the conversation quieted. A moment later, the doorbell rang, and Bast and the Sword Saint entered the room. Rhys carried right on eating, pretending not to notice, much the way a few other patrons were pretending not to notice. It was a hard balance to strike, because he had to pretend to notice just enough to blend in, but not so much that he became suspicious for paying too much attention to the duo. He reined in his mana almost completely, not wanting Bast to react to his presence. It was better for him and Bast if his friends simply didn't notice him. It would mean Bast wouldn't have to lie, or be forced to tell the truth, about Rhys's presence, and Rhys wouldn't have to worry about Bast being put in danger because of his actions. He was here to quietly check up on his friend without alerting anyone to anything. He peeked up from his food as Bast approached the table he and Lily sat at, and he froze. His friend looked rough. Bast had always been larger, bulkier, and more muscular than Rhys, and he still had a large frame, but he was gaunt and pale, his cheeks hollowed out and his muscles standing out sharply against his skin. There wasn't a single scrap of fat on his body, in a bad way. It looked like the life had been sucked right out of him. Rhys glanced at Luke, the Sword Saint, just behind Bast. The man looked healthy, with tanned skin and rosy cheeks, though his eyes were just as vacant as they'd been when the two of them had faced down in the Empress's palace. Bast strode ahead of his mentor, leading the way, while Luke followed after him with ever so slightly stiff motions. Lily noticed his gaze and leaned in, casting that same bubble Madame Tunk had cast. He was injured recently. Don't stare. Recently. In the Empire. No, before that, it was a horrible battle. But he won, and kept us all safe. Don't stare. I suppose that's what happened. Lord Ravin did want to destroy the Alliance, and Luke had stopped him, though Rhys wasn't sure how far one tier 5 to 6 and his two underlings would get. Ravin was a force to be considered, but he'd personally taken down both underlings, and it wasn't like Ravin had an army or the social capital necessary to raise one. A lone tier 5/6 was a formidable force on his own, and the Alliance didn't have many tier 5s, let alone 6s, but they had more than one tier 5, and he was pretty sure they had at least one more tier 6. Surely someone other than Luke could have turned away Lord Ravin. And then he stilled. Or maybe they couldn't. There weren't many people that strong in the Alliance, and the Alliance was known for being weak. The Empress had posed a serious threat to the Alliance. Luke, strongest man in the Alliance, had almost died taking down a single low-ranked lord from the northern region. The Alliance was weak. Weak, weak, weak. He'd spawned in a trash region, as fitting for him, but it did mean the Alliance was in constant mortal danger. It basically existed on the whims of its neighbors, who didn't care to conquer it. It was the Luxembourg of this world, surrounded by powerhouses France and Germany who just didn't care enough to bother conquering it. Except it's way bigger than Luxembourg, Rhys thought, then paused. Was it? He had no idea how large the northern region was. The Empire had been a sprawling beast, with tenuous control of territory several times larger than the Alliance. The Alliance was mile by mile larger than Luxembourg, but was it proportionally larger? He still hadn't explored enough of this world to know. Once I finish up here, that's next on the list, exploration. Hopefully with Bast and Mouse at my side. He lowered his eyes, not wanting to get caught staring. Bast was in a bad place right now. He'd known it even before he'd seen him. Seeing with his own eyes just how bad a shape his friend was in, it hurt, and he couldn't deny it. But if he gave everything away now, he wouldn't save anyone. He had to keep his poker face. He had to hold him. Only then would he be able to ultimately save Bast, and snatch his friend from the jaws of the enemy. As Bast brushed by, Rhys casually tucked a few little hoops into his and Luke's robes. His friend was depressingly now a whole tier lower than him, so he could easily move fast enough that the other man couldn't track his hands. Leaving the hoops on Luke was a bit of a risk, but as he'd expected, Luke didn't react to him at all. It was like there was nothing behind those hollow eyes, and honestly, Rhys was starting to wonder if anything remained of Luke at all. The man had twitched at his joke in the Empress's palace, but that was the last sign of life Rhys had seen from him. Everything else he'd done on order, following commands like a robot. He wasn't completely sure there was something behind those empty eyes, or if Virgil had snuffed out the last spark of Luke between when Rhys had fought. It was more like fleeing with style, him, and now. From his wooden walk and his eyes locked on nothing, it certainly looked like there was less of Luke left than the last time they'd met. And given the horrible shape Bast was in, there was certainly no one protecting him. In public, Luke looked like a soulless husk. In private, Rhys wasn't certain there was any difference. I'll find out soon. He continued to eat his dishes, moving more quickly now that he'd completed his objective. The hoops were on Bast and Luke. Now, he just needed a private place to peep on the two of them. It sounded suspect, even to Rhys himself. He pressed his lips together. I swear I'm not a voyeur. I swear. It's necessary. I'm being forced. Bast and Luke disappeared into a private room, the same way they did every time they came to this restaurant. The second they vanished, everyone relaxed, and conversation started back up again. A few people directly stood up and left, clearly having only attended the restaurant at all so they could see the Sword Saint, or perhaps in the dim hope that this time, the duo wouldn't sequester themselves out of everyone's reach. Rhys wanted to join them, but he refused to be so obvious about it. Besides, there was still some delicious food to eat. No one else seemed super interested in the food, but that was alright. He was fine with being the only one who enjoyed it. It wouldn't be the first time. His standards for food were low. Even as a kid, his friends would complain about cafeteria food, then dining hall food in college, but to Rhys, both were delicious. It probably didn't hurt that his mother was a terrible cook, completely unable to make a palatable dish to save her life. When what awaited him at home was a slog to eat, anything else would taste amazing. And then, once he was out of his childhood home and out in the real world, he hadn't exactly taken care of himself or bothered to learn to cook himself. Cheap ramen cups that mostly tasted like salt were the height of cuisine as far as he was concerned. Crack an egg in the hot noodles, and, phew. That was cooking. Of course, there wasn't a single scrap of mortal cooking that lined up to the worst of mage cooking, and though this food was low quality by mage noble standards, it was high enough quality to be considered mage noble quality in the first place, which meant it tasted beyond amazing to Rhys. He wasn't exactly pushing himself to stick around and finish his meal. I wonder what they have for dessert. He kept low-level track of Bast and Luke through the hoops. The two usually spent a few hours here, then re-emerged and marched straight home. The question was, what were they doing inside the restaurant? From all his points of view outside the restaurant, they entered the private room and then, vanished. If there was any scrap of Luke left, then maybe that was where he was fighting back, but Rhys suspected it was nothing so positive. The only way to find out was to get there, and he couldn't get there by looking from outside. Adding the hoops to their clothes allowed him to let them carry them in, wherein he could then use them to peep, check in on his friend. A horrible thought struck Rhys. Bast and Luke had snuck out of the palace, or whatever they called that upside-down pyramid thingy, to come here, secretly. What if they did it to escape Virgil's gaze and get a little privacy? What if this is a forbidden master-student tryst? Oh gods. If I'm just violating my friend's privacy, I'm so sorry. Oh dear. My eyes might never recover if that's the case. As much as I love my friends, I really don't want to see Bast naked. Besides, it's, icky for me to be peeping on my friend's private life. It's not my place to be peeping on or in any way judging his love life and life choices. If I see anything odd, it's my fault and my fault alone, and I can blame no one but my own dumb ass. I don't think that's what's happening, but since I literally know nothing, I just don't know. But soon he would. Whether he wanted to or not. Whether it was deeply helpful information or forbidden knowledge, he'd know it one way or another. The two hoops stood in the room for a short time, then vanished. A moment later, they reappeared in Rhys's awareness several hundred feet straight down in the earth. Rhys extended his senses out of one of the hoops just enough to get a feel for the situation, only to find Bast and Luke standing there in silence in a vast chamber, waiting in the darkness. If he extended his mana senses further, he was sure he could have seen more, but he was afraid to extend it too far in case either Bast or Luke reacted to the mana sense. After all, they shouldn't encounter any mana sense that deep in the earth, so if they sensed anything at all, he'd be in trouble. Thus, all he could sense was that Luke and Bast were standing alone in a big area, before he quickly retracted his senses. Nothing less, but let's not linger. I want to be alone in case anything goes down, and I have no choice but to intervene. Hopefully he wasn't forced to intervene, since it would blow his plans wide open, but intervening was better than letting Bast die in the worst case. He didn't want to imagine anything that horrible, but Bast's state was so bad that he couldn't help but think about it. He wasn't going to stand by and watch his friend die. His plans weren't worth that. He was stuffing dessert in his mouth when he felt the distant brush of a new aura. A new aura that he recognized in the worst way. Rhys sped up even more, putting gold down on the table and gesturing for Lily to go. They had to motor. Things were about to go down. One of the waiters approached as he stood. Excuse me, sir, but we'll have to ask that you pay at the. Rhys slapped down another sack of gold. The waiter shut his mouth and quietly picked up the money as Rhys led Lily away, out of the restaurant. Was something wrong? Lily asked as they stepped outside. Rhys shook his head. No, I just remembered something I left unfinished at home. He peeked through the hoops again and pressed his lips together. Not good. Very not good. Deep beneath the earth, Virgil approached Bast. Rhys walked at speed back toward his temporary home, moving on autopilot, most of his attention trained on the trio far below them. Virgil approached Bast and Luke, drawing to a stop not far from them. He looked the duo up and down. How strange to meet you here again. Quit the crap. Let's get this over with, Bast snapped, annoyed. Of course. Come. Virgil delivered it as an order, and without question, Luke stepped forward. Bast stood for a second, crossing his arms, then stepped toward Virgil, though with great reluctance. You know, we won't have to do this for much longer, Virgil said. Rhys couldn't see clearly what he was doing, but he was setting something up. Mana flowed around him, and he got the impression of some kind of complicated magical equipment. Soon, the Alliance will have too much on its hands to protest my leadership. I was hoping the war with the Empire could serve as that distraction, once I established my rule, of course. Ah, so that's why they didn't strike when they told me it was go time. They wanted to drag it out, not take out the Empire in one. And then I fucked it all up by killing the Empress, and Virgil was forced to show his hand, or else look weak, Rhys realized, snapping. He'd figured it was something like that, but it was good to have confirmation. As for why they hadn't immediately attacked, well, clearly Virgil was too focused on internal politics to worry about an external attack. Hell, for all Rhys knew, Virgil was right in the middle of his plot with taking over the Alliance via Luke when the Empire attacked, and they'd been a great annoyance to his plan. Actually, that's kind of how the timelines line up, he realized. He still didn't think the Alliance had ever planned to fight back, but had instead planned to cede their land right from the start, but certainly, Virgil wouldn't have wanted to get involved in a messy war until he'd consolidated his power. And then the real implication of what Virgil had said struck him, and he gulped. And he's about to kick something off on the same scale as the Empire's attack. Oh. His mind instantly went to the dissolved straw, hidden away in the Alliance's heart. Ernesto had been a fringe researcher, tucked away in the basement of Purple Dawn. Now, he was part of the core government in the center of the Alliance. Why would Virgil make that change, and involve himself with someone known to study cursed energy, which itself carried a stigma in the Alliance, unless he had something to do with Virgil's plan? He raised his brows, then sucked a slow breath. If straw was part of Virgil's plan, that might be deeply problematic. Cursed energy was akin to impurities, and impurified mages, mana. If he planned something like spreading little bits of straw around, then erupting them into mass explosions of cursed energy, not unlike what Rhys had done with his potato chip impurities, he'd have effectively created the mage equivalent of a bioweapon or dirty bomb, something that didn't seem that bad in the moment but which would only get worse and worse as things progressed and time passed. Ah, shit, I really shouldn't have done the potato chip thing. It was awesome in the moment, but I only seeded the idea in the world around me. It was too late now for regrets. He couldn't put that genie back in the bottle. Rhys pressed his lips together, then took a deep breath. Maybe Virgil wasn't planning that. Maybe it was totally unrelated. Maybe the sky is red. I dunno. Either way, events were continuing down below the earth. He reached his house at last and beelined for the smoking room, hiding away in its relative safety. Down with Virgil, Bast watched as Luke stepped into a magic circle. Virgil turned to him. He gave Bast a tired look and sighed dramatically. Do we really have to do this every time? I will never willingly throw myself away. Virgil snorted. Isn't that the truth? If it wasn't for Luke almost dying to that northern lord, you would have continued to refuse the mark, too, wouldn't you? Bast said nothing. For a moment, there was silence, and then Virgil did the tired sigh again. Well, since you've decided to be stubborn, let's do this the hard way. Step into the circle, please. Rhys's ears perked up. When Virgil said the words, his tone changed, and not only that, he pushed mana into his words, making them a compulsion. Bast shuddered, then stepped forward unwillingly, striding into a circle that nearly matched Luke's. If it wasn't for those damned rogue nobles, we wouldn't have to do this, you know. I don't like this any more than you do, but I need Luke to be the big scary boogeyman, or else they won't obey me. I hate stripping away your potential, but if Luke shows himself to be the paper tiger he is, I won't stand a chance, and you're simply not strong enough to be the boogeyman yet. Rhys jolted. What was he doing to Bast? No. Fuck, no. That's literally the worst thing you can do to a mage. Is he serious? He almost leapt in, but he held himself back. Luke was the boogeyman. Even he couldn't rightfully say he could defeat the man in all surety, even knowing that the Sword Saint was barely a step above a puppet. Rhys took a slow breath and forced himself to calm down. It was fine. No, it wasn't fine, but now wasn't the time to intervene. He had all his other plans, and they all had to go off if he was going to truly, fully, once and for all, free Bast from the Alliance. Besides, this had clearly been going on for some time. Even if he leapt in here, he wouldn't undo what had been done, he'd just tip his hand for little gain. That being said, he wasn't happy to see it happening, but it was valuable to see exactly what happened. It would make it easier to reverse later, because of course he was going to reverse this. He didn't know what it was, or how he'd do it, but he was completely sure that he wasn't going to let his friend's potential get stripped away. Bast didn't deserve that. He was a talent, and he deserved to have his talent grow, not watch someone else steal it from him. The circles at Bast and Luke's respective feet lit up, and gold light began to pour out. Energy appeared around Bast, swirling around his body and just over his skin. His brows furrowed, and then the energy began to lift off of him, passing over to Luke. Bast grunted in pain, while Luke closed his eyes, a serene expression on his face as though he was bathed in warm water. Rhys focused on the energy. It wasn't quite mana, and it definitely wasn't cursed energy, it was something else, something he'd never sensed before. Was this what Virgil called potential? Whatever it was, he locked the feeling of it into his heart, so he could pull it all back out of Luke later. Every last scrap, and not let an ounce of Bast's energy go to waste. The light faded. Bast stepped back, swaying in place, and caught his breath. He looked even more wan than he had before, even more unhealthy than when he'd stepped into the restaurant, his eyes were sunken, and he looked absolutely haggard. Luke, on the other hand, all but glowed, looking even more energetic than when he'd stepped down here. Yeah, it's pretty clear what's going on here. Rhys sighed and withdrew, only leaving a bare scrap of mana sense behind to monitor the scene and make sure nothing else happened, but he was pretty sure he'd caught the bulk of it. Luke was a puppet, Bast was feeding him energy, both of them had marks that basically beheld them to Virgil's every whim. Rhys sighed aloud, dragging his hands down his face. It was the worst case scenario all around. Bast was getting fucked, at least not literally, but honestly. This wasn't much better. Luke was gone. Whatever tiny bit of him had remained during the battle had vanished by now, leaving nothing but a husk. Virgil was in total control, and he had some sketchy, big plan, coming up, real soon, that Rhys should probably not show up to school that day, for. Fuck, he complained aloud, just to get it off his chest. Fuck, this was bad, this was real bad, it was way worse than he'd thought. But it wasn't hopeless. He sat upright. There were rogue nobles Virgil couldn't control. He could rally them. He probably didn't have the time to rebuild Norton's social capital from scratch and get that moving, but he didn't have to. He had Madame Tunk. I have Madame Tunk. Rhys abruptly stood and barged out of the smoking room. Lily, darling. What? Lily asked, jumping out of the kitchen. A half-finished meal sizzled on the stove, and he abruptly recalled that she hadn't eaten at the restaurant. They didn't need to eat, but as a noble mage used to 3 meals a day, she probably felt shorted by that. Your mother-in-law. My mother. Madame Tunk. What about her? Can you invite her for dinner? Tonight, please. Tonight. Lily's brows flew up, and her eyes went as big as dinner plates. Yes. Is that too short notice? No, I'm sure she'd be happy to eat with us. Lily said, suddenly scrambling. You go back in the smoking room, and I'll get it all coordinated. Rhys hesitated, then shrugged. She had just offered to do all the hard work. Was he going to say no? Okay. Just let me know if you need any help. I can handle it. She pushed him out of the kitchen and back toward the smoking room. Wait. Rhys took a deep breath, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he drew all the impurities in the house toward him, save the useful ones in the smoking room. All the dust, dirt, and grime flew toward him, then vanished into his core, leaving the entire house sparkling clean. Lily froze. She stared around them, absolutely shocked, then slowly turned back to Rhys, her jaw still agape. There. That should make your job a little easier. Rhys smiled and walked into the smoking room, getting out of her way to let her do whatever she felt needed to be done. He spent the afternoon quietly practicing in the smoking room, though he didn't get much done. The light flowing from Bast to loop just kept replaying in his head on loop, and the sick sensation of powerlessly watching someone steal his friend's potential equally looped inside him. He couldn't do anything, not right now. He would, very soon. But it hurt. It hurt to see Bast in that shitty situation and be unable to help. And there's Mouse, too. I can't imagine she's in a good situation. He sucked a deep breath, then let it out, slowly. Focus. I won't win if I get distracted. These horrible things are happening to people I care deeply about, but if I move now, I won't solve anything. The only way to solve them is to keep going and finish it for once and for all. A bell rang. Rhys stood, refreshing his robes with a quick touch and steadied himself, putting his problems to the back of his mind. Just outside the door, a well-dressed mage with noble bearing waited for the maid to invite her in. Madame Tunk had arrived. It was time for the trashiest maneuver of this whole plan, politics. "Why, Norton, dear, how good of you to invite me to dinner," Madame Tunk said, leaning in to fake kiss his cheeks. "Of course, mother," Rhys replied with a smile, indulging her. When she was done, he stepped back, and she clapped his arms and leaned back as well, taking him in. "You look healthy. I'm glad to see you finally taking your practice seriously. I simply came to my senses. Wasting away my life was such a waste," Rhys said, shaking his head regrettably. He offered her his arm. "The maid has been busy cooking up a storm. Shall we sample her hard work?" Madame Tunk nodded and let him lead her into the dining room. He let her take the lead in the dining room, where she chose her seat and stood beside it, waiting for him to pull it out for her, then push her in. Ever the dutiful son, Rhys obeyed. For his part, he took the seat at the head of the table, and Lily naturally took the seat to his right. His mother sat to his left. The maid appeared a few seconds after they were all seated with their first course. They set to, eating a few bites before Rhys cleared his throat. "Mother, I was thinking, social season is almost upon us. I know I have my lovely wife." He offered Lily his hand, and she took it, and he gave it a little squeeze because that was what happy couples did in sitcom dinners, "but I was thinking that it's time for me to make my re-debut as a changed man and devoted husband. I've been remiss in not taking part in social season for the last few years, but this year is the year to change all of that. Darling, I thought you'd never ask. Have you made arrangements? I was thinking of attending the Yankees ball. That piddling thing. No, no, no. Not my son. No. There's a far more fitting ball for someone of your stature going on at the same time. Have you ever heard of LitRPG?" Rhys blinked. The name was familiar, in a distant, deeply distant way. Somehow, he associated it with straw, and Bast. He leaned forward, then snapped his fingers. "Roses. She uses roses, right? Yes. That's her. She's the leader of one of the strongest schools in the region, with mages who number in the hundreds and 2 Tier 4 powerhouses under her. And a habit of bullying a master and his 2 harmless disciples for no reason," Rhys added silently. She'd been the one to lead the attack on Straw that had separated Rhys, Bast, and Straw in the first place. She'd fought and captured Straw. How connected is she with Ernesto? How much does she know about Straw's capture? Is she still related to his present condition, or did she simply capture him, then forget about it? 1,000 questions ran through Rhys's mind, and he tensed subtly. This could very much be walking into the jaws of the lion, or it could be marching to the one person who knew the most about Straw, yet was uninvolved in the following conspiracy. She could be the key to unlocking the final secrets around Straw, or she could know nothing at all. He just didn't know. Unaware of the 1,000 thoughts running through Rhys's mind, Madame Tunk pressed on. "Lady Ilya is holding a ball at the end of the week. I have already secured an invitation for myself, and if I reached out, I'm sure I could secure an invitation for you and Lily, of course, Lily darling." Madame Tunk turned and smiled at Lily, who smiled back. "I'm quite pleased my son is finally stepping into his future role as the head of the Tunk family. I can't wait to see how you blossom in the future." Rhys fake smiled back, squinting his eyes almost shut. "You and I both know that's not gonna happen. You're just reminding me that I'm going to owe the Tunk family later. I get it. Hey, as long as you don't mind a trashy solution to your problem, I'm happy to provide." Madame Tunk patted Rhys's hand. "You leave it to mother, I'll get everything figured out for you." "Thank you. Of course. I knew I could count on you." He patted her hand back, and they shared a smile. With that settled, the trio went back to dinner. For a while, they dined in comfortable silence, until Rhys sat up and looked at Madame Tunk. "Mother, I have something private to ask you." Madame Tunk nodded. Dabbing her lips with her napkin, she waved her hand almost distractedly. A bubble of energy formed around her and Rhys alone, leaving out the rest of the world, including Lily. Rhys breathed out quietly. He hadn't been sure what he'd say if she included Lily. He didn't dislike Lily, but he didn't trust her either. He simply didn't know her well enough to know if he could trust her or not. He wasn't sure he could trust Madame Tunk either, but he needed her to know what he was going to say, if he was going to kick this thing off the way he wanted to. Besides, she hadn't revealed his secret so far, so at the bare minimum, he knew she was the kind of person who kept her mouth shut. True, Lily hadn't shared his secret either, but firstly, he was pretty sure Lily didn't have as good a hold on his secret as Madame Tunk did, and secondly, Lily was involved in trying to poison Norton. He would be a fool to trust a woman who would poison her husband, even if he totally deserved it. Nothing against Lily, to be honest. There was nothing wrong with being selfish and protecting yourself first. But knowing that she was that kind of person, meant she would definitely spit out any secrets she heard if she was put in a place of danger. Not that Madame Tunk wouldn't, but Madame Tunk was stronger and politically connected, in other words, less likely to land herself in danger. She had the smarts, strength, and connections to keep herself safe, whereas Lily was just a low-level noble who was relatively secluded from the world of mage nobility thanks to her shitbag of a husband. If things went sideways, Madame Tunk could fight her way out, or, better yet, socially pressure and threaten the attacker into backing out. Lily couldn't do either of those things. Her option was basically to cry and die. It was safer for everyone, Rhys and Lily alike, to leave her out of it. He prodded the bubble with his mana. When he was satisfied that it was complete, he reached out to Madame Tunk instead, inspecting her mana and body with his mana senses. He sensed no sign of Virgil's mark, so he nodded at Madame Tunk. What is your opinion on the current state of the Alliance? If she was a die-hard Virgil fan, it wouldn't matter what he said, she'd ignore it all. If his first wouldn't hadn't taught him that, it hadn't taught him anything at all. She chuckled. Ah, so that's why you inspected me. Rhys sat there silently, giving no indication one way or another. I consider myself neutral. Getting deeply involved in politics is a way to ruin. I'm more interested in strengthening myself and my family. She knitted her fingers and gave him a look. Rhys nodded. Excellent. That was the best answer he could have gotten. He understood that she was trying to tell him, I don't care, I don't want to get involved, but as someone who deeply needed to get people involved whether they wanted to or not, a skeptic neutral outsider was the ideal co-conspirator. It meant people likely considered her a rational mind rather than a biased radical, someone they could trust to have an even-handed take on things. He leaned forward. What if I told you Virgil had a plan to attack the Alliance as a false flag in order to consolidate power and force the Alliance into a war that would cement his power in the long term? She raised her brows. Those are serious accusations. Do you have any proof? Nothing you would believe, but I'm working on it. The question is, would that change anything about Virgil's rule? Would proof be enough to force him out of power? Madame Tunk raised her brows, then chuckled. You're the curious one, aren't you? Yes, of course it would. Well, I came from a world where this much proof wouldn't do shit to the correct person. Rhys smiled back. Wonderful. And then her smile vanished, and she looked him in the eye. As long as you took care of Luke. With the Sword Saint on his side, he holds the true center of strength in the Alliance. So long as he controls Luke, his word is law and truth, regardless of whatever may actually happen. And that's more what I expected. In my world, it's money, in this world, it's mana. As long as there's power, there will be those who abuse it. And so long as there's people willing to abuse their power, the truth will never be anything more than a farce. Only by eliminating power can we discover reality. Rhys took a deep breath and nodded. Well, it didn't matter. He'd already known that, and he'd already planned around it. Of course. Just leave me out of it, she sighed, sitting back. I'm afraid I can't do that, Rhys replied. Madame Tunk raised her brows. Even when I could blow your current situation wide open. That's fine. Go ahead. I'll simply find another face, Rhys replied evenly. He sat forward. Madame Tunk, I understand that you don't want me to involve you. Deeply and sincerely, I would also not like to be involved in this. However, for the good of the Alliance. He went silent. Madame Tunk waited. After a second, he looked up again, smiling. Well, we both know that's bullshit, right? She snorted. Rightly so. You're a smart lady, so let me give it to you straight. Virgil harmed my friends, so I'm going to fuck him up. This is a personal vendetta. Coincidentally, it also helps the Alliance. Knowing that I'm that kind of person, Madame Tunk, would you like to be on my side, or against me? She sat up straight, adjusting her posture. The threats are unnecessary. I believe I've already made my preference clear. Then let us become allies, Madame Tunk. I like you, and I don't mind assisting you or your family in the future. I have no intention of involving you more than I have to, but I don't have access to the town's rumor mill, and you do. If you sow the seeds of doubt, I will take responsibility for them and capitalize on them, without involving you more than the bare minimum. I do not want you to fight for me, nor take the blame for me. Is that acceptable? Madame Tunk nodded. That is acceptable, on one condition. Rhys waited. You must not wear my son's face when you make your move. He grinned, then laughed, unable to stop himself. Don't worry, Madame Tunk. When I come for Virgil, I want him to know who's killing him. I want him to understand the mistakes he's made, and regret them in the moments before he dies. So confident. He said nothing. He simply looked her in the eye. Madame Tunk shifted in her seat, then chuckled. Well, the Tunks have always preferred to back the winning horse. If you're the Alliance's next ruler. No, I have no interest in ruling. Like I said, this is a personal vendetta, plain and clear. I truly have no other interest but killing Virgil. He leaned forward. But if you would like me to hand the Alliance over to a person of your choosing, say the word. That easily? She asked, shocked. Why not? In my experience, those who grasp power never let go of it so easily. Rhys sat back. He spread his hands. I'm just a piece of trash, madam. I'm a lazy asshole. Controlling the Alliance would be a waste of my time and effort when I could be lazing around enjoying life instead. I deeply, earnestly, from the bottom of my heart, not only do not want to run the Alliance, but the very idea disgusts me. When I say you can name your man, I really mean it, but I really mean it. Think deeply and choose someone who makes sense, aligns with your values, whom you trust, and who can maintain control without me, because once I finish here, I intend to leave and never return. Honestly, Madame Tunk was solving a problem for him. She was negotiating for control of the Alliance, but Rhys couldn't be more happy to shove that problem off on someone else. He didn't mind leaving a trashy power vacuum behind him, but he'd seen that go wrong as many times as he'd seen it happen. He'd rather leave the country with a stable leader, regardless of what stability meant. After all, he really was not doing this for the sake of the Alliance. He couldn't stress that enough. The Alliance's continued success was immaterial to his actions. He didn't mind that the Alliance benefited, but if Virgil hadn't stolen Mouse and harmed Bast, he could have happily walked away and left him to it. Instead, Virgil had harmed his friends, so now he had to get revenge, but the fact that getting revenge also meant kicking the Alliance into a dark age was a mild annoyance at the back of his mind. If Madame Tunk could solve that problem, then he'd just checked all the boxes, and he no longer had to worry about anything anymore. He leaned forward. So, what do you say? She took a deep breath, looking down, then met his eyes. This is quite the tempting proposition, if it's true. I'll think about it. Please. I wouldn't want it any other way. Rhys met her eyes, momentarily flaring his trash star to deliberately give her a glimpse of his true power before hiding it once again. Just understand that I am deadly serious about everything I said today, and about it remaining between us. Of course, darling. I wouldn't have it any other way. Her motherly smile returned, and she patted his hand. The bubble vanished. Thank you, mother. I'm so glad you understand, Rhys replied, as if they were speaking of a totally different subject. The maid approached with their next course, and the dinner resumed. Dinner ended, and Rhys saw Madame Tunk out. She continued the act of the doting mother all the way out the door, never once breaking it, and neither did Rhys act outside of the role of the turnabout son. It wasn't necessary. They'd said what needed to be said. He closed the door and stepped back. Evidence, huh? He did need proof. He hadn't ever imagined that just saying, hey guys. By the way, Virgil's about to use the straw man to attack the Alliance and blame it on an outside force to wrap you guys in a long war so that he can consolidate power. Was going to get him very far. He was just some sketchy dude. He needed hard, concrete proof if he was actually going to convince anyone. But what the hell is that proof going to be? It wasn't like this world had video recorders. He couldn't film Virgil confessing parts of his plan and hope it was enough to convince the world. He needed something physical, something undeniable. He pinched his chin. As a guy who did these sprawling plans, who had previously done basically this except not false flag, this kind of plan took some setting up. There should be some evidence out there in the world right now, if he knew what to look for. But that's the question. Do I know what to look for? It could be anything. Potato chips, for example. Though, looking at Virgil, he wasn't the kind of entrepreneurial sort to set up an entire business and fake out plan in order to flip the tables at the last second. His plans were probably a bit more obvious than Rhys's. Less subtle and, if Rhys had to guess, less cool, too. What could be cooler than setting up an entire potato chip empire, after all? Probably a lot of things. But Virgil isn't that cool of a dude, so I doubt he succeeded at beating my coolness benchmark. He chuckled to himself, then waved his hand. The point was, there should be physical evidence somewhere in the Alliance. The problem was the somewhere in the Alliance part. There was a lot of Alliance, and when all he had to go on was cursed energy, that was a lot of the Alliance to deal with. But it's not like I have to walk the whole thing. I have my cursed energy sense, and I have my trash teleports, too. He grinned. From right here in the smoking room, he could already survey a good chunk of the Alliance. If he found nothing, he could at least ignore that part of the alliance. If he found something, then he was good. He only needed one, after all. He wasn't trying to provide incontrovertible proof. That was the job of lawyers and investigators, long after anything was actually relevant. He was just trying to find enough proof to cause problems for Virgil and cause rifts among the nobles, so that he could later have the advantage when he made his move. It also wouldn't hurt if it caused enough of a rift amongst the alliance's nobles that his fight with Virgil was a one-on-one duel, as opposed to all the alliance's might hammering him at the same time. He was strong enough to fight Virgil once he stripped away the Sword Saint. He wasn't strong enough to take on all the alliance's tier 4s at the same time, and also kill Virgil dead, and also ensure the Sword Saint was out of the picture. He snorted a little. It was a grim thought, but now that he knew the Sword Saint was just a puppet Virgil controlled, he was honestly in a better spot than he'd been before. Before, the Sword Saint might have been a force on his own, whether he was loyal to Virgil or simply thought Virgil didn't deserve to get put down like the rabid dog he was. Now, all Rhys had to do was yoink the mark, and the Sword Saint was kaput. Nothing. Ruined. Ruined like Virgil had ruined Bast trying to prop the Sword Saint up. Rhys rubbed his face. Fuck, man, I can't keep thinking like this. He'd figure something out with Bast. He would. He had to. It was really fucking with his head more than he wanted to let on. That was the worst thing he could imagine. Having your potential and mana stripped away and fed into someone else, fuck. It put his hair on end. It made his skin crawl. It was the sound of fingernails on blackboard, and the more he dwelled on it, the worse it made him feel. Push it back. Push the thoughts back. It's okay. I'm going to fix it. I am. Fucking Virgil. I'm gonna turn him into a human stick. He wasn't really the type to want to torture his enemies, or kill them in some horrific way, but for the first time, Virgil had awakened that desire in him. Thinking about Virgil made him understand those medieval punishments where they drew and quartered people, or put them on wheels and stretched them to death, or 1,000 other disgusting things. Well, I think Virgil's the first person I've encountered to deserve it. Or at least the first person I've encountered where I personally feel he deserves it. He was pretty sure there were people who felt very strongly that the Empress deserved that kind of death, but he wasn't those people, so he didn't feel that way. It was the trashy, selfish part of him that saw Virgil as worse than the Empress. Objectively, the Empress had caused more harm to more people. But Virgil had caused more harm to the people he personally cared about, so he wanted Virgil to meet a bad end far more than he'd cared about the Empress meeting a bad end. Focus, Rhys. Let's get this done with and move on. He settled into a cross-legged sit and reached out through a hoop, into the void, and out through all his various hoops, teleport points, trash cans, and so on, scanning for any spikes of cursed energy. After all, if he was right and Virgil was planning to use straw for an attack, the attack would have to be cursed energy based. Then again, maybe not. But the point was, straw was basically just a big sponge for cursed energy. Whatever Virgil was planning to do with straw, whether the attack was made of cursed energy or not, as long as it involved straw, it would also involve cursed energy. An early spike caught his attention, and he reached out further through that hoop, curious, but it was the ruins of Purple Dawn, and the location of Ernesto's old laboratory. He prodded at it as far as he could from the hoop, but didn't sense a smoking gun, just the residue of old cursed energy research. Putting it into the back of his mind for later, he moved on. Another spike caught his attention. He sent all his mana senses toward that one direction, only to find an untapped impure well. That was worth pausing for, so he leapt into the portals and slurped it up real quick, then jumped back into the smoking room, another piece of his skeleton Mount Richer. A lake caught his attention next, but after a close examination, it seemed to just be a place where many drownings had occurred, where cursed energy naturally gathered. He gathered it in passing, but the natural flow of currents and the way the water collected at that spot meant drownings would continue to occur, and cursed energy would gather soon once more. At the end of the day, he wasn't a civil engineer, and he couldn't possibly predict what would happen downstream if he adjusted the flow of the river to make cursed energy no longer gather there, so he left it be. Not for nothing, but some rivers just drown people, after all. Back in my world, there's a few rivers that they've rerouted all they want, built bridges and redirected them, but they still keep drowning people because that's just what they are, killing rivers. Foolishly meddling with natural things is a good way to keep killing people. Even, potentially, killing more people, because when you change things, you'll expose new people to those things, and those new people won't know what to expect, therefore, they'll die learning their lesson, whereas the old people used to those things know it kills people. Thus, he left it. Also, maybe, moving thousands of tons of earth and water was no small feat and would draw attention, and also sounded like a lot of hard work he didn't care to deal with. But who was to say? Who's to say? Aside from getting distracted by the river, he also ran into another dozen cursed energy spots that had nothing to do with him, Virgil, or anyone. At last, he was scanning the trash cans left scattered around the Empire in vain hope that one of them would give him joy. His brows furrowed. Was he wrong? Was this not the right direction to go in? But Virgil had straw, and he was using him for something, right? Maybe I reached too far. Just because he brought Ernesto and straw here, doesn't mean that's what he's using for his attack. Maybe he's just massed up some loyalist soldiers. Though that didn't make sense. If Virgil had a large enough quantity of loyalist soldiers to seriously threaten the alliance, he wouldn't need to cling so hard to the Sword Saint, he could just call on them. Well, maybe that's not it. Maybe it's the northern territories that he's going to incite to attack. But that didn't make sense either. The northern territories' attack, in the first place, had been the last thrashing of a sore loser, aka Lord Ravin, and all his armies, retainers, and allies were dead. Hell, Lord Ravin might be dead at this point, given that Rhys had last seen him with a mildly bored sit at his side. Obsidian, Sable's father, wasn't the most stable person, as both he and Sable would attest. The chances that Lord Ravin had drawn up a new army under the situation Rhys had left him in were far lower than the chances he was dead. And aside from Lord Ravin, he'd been to the north. There was no real sentiment among those giants that they wanted to attack the alliance, and though it was far easier to mass forces and move men around than in his world, there still hadn't been any evidence of the north massing an army to attack the alliance. Plus, he was pretty sure Lord Virgil didn't have any pull on the north. Which means it's either something I know absolutely nothing about, or straw. But if it's straw, there'd be cursed energy, and I'm just not sensing any. Rhys slowed. He pinched his chin, thinking. Was that his problem? He was out here assuming that straw meant there had to be a spike of cursed energy. A spike. But straw could be separated into, well, straws. It was entirely possible that straw could be distributed across every farm and stable in the alliance, separated into such tiny scraps of cursed energy that even Rhys's cursed energy senses couldn't detect them. Rhys licked his lips. Then, that means. Figured it out, did you? That's right. My weapons are versatile. Straw is terrifying when he's all in one place, but he's also ideal for sneak attacks, Darren bragged, barging into Rhys's thoughts. Rhys turned, scowling at Darren. Yeah, it's fantastic. How am I going to use him as evidence in that case, huh? If you look closely at this particular strand of straw, you'll find it's got a little more cursed energy than the rest. He shook his head. No one's going to listen to me. Darren spread his hands. That's not my problem. I'm just happy to see my weapons used so effectively after all this time. It's the satisfaction a maestro feels when the symphony perfectly hits all the notes he wrote. Rhys flipped him off, and Darren made a rude gesture right back. Rhys sighed. This is getting us nowhere. Maybe I'll just have to move on without the nobles' support. Is it? Don't you already have all the evidence you need? Darren asked. Rhys looked at him questioningly. Darren pointed, through the wall of the smoking room, outside, at the pyramid overhead, and straw, hidden away inside its highest chambers. Rhys clapped. He stood, gazing at the pyramid. Damn, I can't believe I didn't realize. You're so right, Darren. Yes, praise me more. How do I get him out, though, and the timing is going to be, Rhys twisted his lips. Nothing's ever perfect, Darren commented unhelpfully. I know. Shut up. Let's go back to when you were praising me. Ignoring Darren, Rhys kept staring at the pyramid, the gears turning in his head. This could work. It could. It wouldn't be easy, but it could work. Rhys adjusted the way his robes hung, gazing at the mirror. He took a deep breath, somehow still not used to seeing Norton Tunk's face staring back at him, even if he'd been wearing it longer than he'd worn most of his recent faces. Somehow, it just didn't feel right. And then he laughed, and Norton laughed with him. It isn't like Rhys's face is, my face, either. It's just the one I've adopted. Yet, Norton still didn't feel like him. It was strange to watch the man he killed laugh, so after a moment, he stopped and looked away. He'd wanted to prepare more. He'd wanted to have proof in hand, Bast safe, mouse located and secured, and his final battle plotted out from first to final step. Instead, he had proof over there, Bast over there, mouse somewhere, and the final battle is a big question mark with some general squigglies of a plan around it. And then there's Soma, whom I know nothing about. For all I know, he's an enemy now. Or he's converted the dungeon into his harem. Even odds on either, in my opinion. There were threads. He'd grasped them all, but he hadn't pulled a one of them. In an ideal world, he'd pull them one at a time, slowly dismantling the sweater that was the alliance under Virgil's control. But this wasn't an ideal world, so he'd be yanking them all at once and hoping it all came together. It really made him uncomfortable to have so much riding on him all at once right here, right now, but it couldn't be helped. If he pulled any one of the threads, rescued Bast, stole Mouse, saved Soma, grasped Straw, aka his proof, the enemy would know he was here and know basically what he was planning, and reinforce all the other threads he wanted to pull. Hence, him running around like a madman gathering up all these loose ends to do nothing but sit on them and wait. Wait for today, that was. The day it all came together. Darling, are you ready? Will I ever be? Rhys muttered to himself. Lily approached him from behind, luminous in her new robes, her hair and makeup perfect. She tilted her head. If you don't want to go, we can stay at. No, we're going. We're definitely going. If he backed out of this, he'd never find the guts to finish this. He'd confirmed it with Madame Tunk. Virgil was highly likely to show his face at this ball. If he didn't, then Rhys was going to have a lovely time with Lily and do some more scouting, and cry a little on the inside that he'd have to sit on this tension for another week or two until the next big social event. He wouldn't mind, really. He could spread the rumor about Virgil's plan with Straw, even without any evidence. He'd recruited Madame Tunk to do the same, but it didn't hurt to spread it around a little more. Of course, it wasn't exactly essential, either, so he wasn't too worried about it one way or another. The point was, ideally, Virgil would be there. Ideally. They set off, mounting a carriage Madame Tunk had hired for them. All of them could fly, teleport, or otherwise proceed through rapid magical means to the ball, but nonetheless, the streets were full of carriages. It was fashionable, or something. Rhys didn't see why they couldn't all just fly there, but whatever floated the mage nobles' boats. Nobles and rich people never did rational things. At that point, they were basically a different species that didn't act according to rationality or reason, but according to what made them look the flashiest to their fellow nobles. He'd never wanted to be a part of that kind of life, and now that he was, he didn't enjoy it. He wasn't a keeping up with the Joneses kind of guy. He'd rather sit in his video game basement and pretend the Joneses didn't exist. Now that he was forced to take part in the do-it-to-look-good carriage traffic jam, he had to admit, it was pretty trashy. Not just in the conventional way, of being a shitty thing to do for little reason or benefit, which it was, but also in a new, special way. In his world, it would have been private jets, spewing smoke and carbon and trashing up the atmosphere unnecessarily for very little benefit to only those at the highest peak of economic power. In this world, it was the rather more mundane issue of horse shit, because unlike mages, magical beasts didn't stop pooping and eating at high realms. They just ate and pooped more powerfully, leaving more toxic waste behind in both senses of more. For his part, Rhys quietly opened the carriage door a crack so he could absorb the highly toxic horse poop as they passed over it. It wasn't worth a whole lot of trash at this point, but it wasn't worth nothing, either. Do you need some air? Lily asked, noticing him leaning toward the door. No, I'm fine. We can stop. He looked at her. I'm really fine. Are you sure? You aren't. You used to be bad with carriages. Oh, did Norton get motion sick? Luckily, I'm the new and improved version of Norton, who's leveled up and overcome his past. Damn, it sure is easy to replace someone in this world, huh? If you misplay a habit of theirs, you can just pretend like you've achieved enlightenment and no longer obey that habit. I overcame that through practice, effort, and hard work, Rhys declared, without a single hesitation in his heart. Lily rolled her eyes and sat back on the chair, already tired. Well, maybe it's not that easy. After all, Lily and Madame Tunk both caught me pretty easily. Then again, I'm no actor. I'm pretty trash at playing roles, to be honest. If I was in the school play, they'd make me a tree or something, so all I had to do was stand in the back and not move. Luckily, he'd gone to an elementary school too low budget and disinterested in the arts to bother with things like kids' plays, so he simply skipped that unnecessary embarrassment. Though, now that he was an adult, what was the point of kids' plays? Humiliation. Blackmail. It wasn't like the kids who could act well in elementary school were actually going to make anything of it, after all. Child stars were all exclusively the children of rich people who could afford things like children's coaching, or, better yet, had the direct line nepotism into the film/stage industry to hook their kids up with deals and acting gigs. No ordinary elementary school kid, not even a prodigy, was going to get discovered from a school play. It simply wasn't how the world worked. Not that reality ever stopped suburban soccer moms from knowing that their precious little baby was destined to be the world's next number one. Fill in the blank here, he thought, and snorted. Thinking back to all the urban progression fantasy he'd read, where the hell were those characters? He suddenly deeply desired a pushy soccer mom shoving her shitty little system user kid forward as the #1 best system apocalypse defeater, regardless of how shit the kid actually was at defeating system apocalypses, or whatever world-shattering threat they were up against today. Damn, that'd make a great comedy. He sighed. Too bad this world just didn't have the same system of well-integrated media delivery that his world did. It was really the only downside, but damn, what a downside. It meant he had nothing to read on this boring, long-ass carriage ride through the unnecessary carriage traffic jam, and nothing to do but ad-lib and constantly agonize over his upcoming plans in his head. He supposed he could talk to Lily, but that meant talking to people. Because Lily was people, not people. She was a popular kid, 100%, and he knew from years of experience that if he opened his mouth, she'd bully him to death. Sure, casual interactions were fine, but if he actually talked to her and actually started chatting about things he liked, her expression would just twist into more and more disgust until he finally had no option but to stop talking. It was why he didn't like people, but Mouse and Sable and Lyra, and even Mirai, Grave, Soma, and Sid were fine. They were all real people. They had weird hobbies and strange preferences, and they weren't afraid to admit it. People like Lily still had weird hobbies and strange preferences, they just hid it like the cowards they were, or worse, didn't have anything at all. Vanilla was a great flavor, but if it was all someone's life was made up of, then he couldn't help but feel sorry for them. Never experiencing the full rainbow of what life had to offer was such a sad way to live. Of course, the upside of this world was that even if Lily was vanilla-ass people and wanted to bully him to death for his weird habits and hobbies, she couldn't, because he was more powerful than her. He just didn't want to end up in that situation either, where Lily was clearly suppressing her judgment out of fear of death. It just wasn't that fun. He didn't have that kink. And besides, suppressing her judgment to his face wasn't the scary part of people. The scary part was how they'd talk to their friends later and spread rumors. Even if he didn't care, that didn't mean he liked it. Or didn't have complexes about it, anyways. I think my first world left me a bit more fucked up than I realized, he mused. The carriage rolled along slowly, inching forward one carriage length at a time. Rhys peered out the window, getting a good look at the venue before they arrived. It was the Trashy family mansion, which felt less like a venue and more like, come over to my house and hang out, except this wasn't a hanging out kind of house. One time, he'd gone to the UK on a school trip and gone to a mansion that had been mostly converted to a museum. The walls were gilded. The house had sweeping, 20-foot-high ceilings, all of them dripping with chandeliers, and the walls were just about papered with oil paintings, some of them artistically significant. The stone facade was more grand than most government buildings, and the intricate gardens stretched for miles all around. This mansion was that same kind of building. In fact, he could barely see it due to the expansive rose gardens that surrounded the land. It was out on the outskirts of the capital, with the giant inverted pyramid serving as a distant looming landmark rather than the oppressively ever-present monolith it served as within the capital, and being out this far clearly provided opportunities for opulence that being with the capital didn't. It had that same kind of stone facade he'd seen back in the UK, decked out with stone statues and fine architectural details, though it was topped with a giant ruby carved into the shape of a rose in total defiance of any sort of rational architecture, weight limits, or material strength. Mages in opulent robes wandered the rose gardens, holding candy-colored drinks that faintly glowed, even from here, and conversed with one another, clearly enjoying themselves. Rhys, stuck in the carriage, could only lean his head on his hand and sigh. I'm in another world, and I've finally been invited to a really cool party, and where am I? Stuck in the traffic jam waiting to get in. This wouldn't happen if I had main character energy. Still, obtrusively barging in on a rare magical beast or overwhelmingly powerful artifact wasn't the way to blend in with the nobles, so maybe his lack of main character energy was for the best. He wasn't trying to make a scene. Yet, he curled his hand, gripping the imaginary strings. It couldn't be that hard. He just had to do everything all at once, perfectly, with no mistakes. Good luck, me. At last, their carriage reached the front of the line. The footman opened the door and helped Lily out, and Rhys hopped out after her, smiling all around. A few people stared at him and whispered, or rather, stared at Tunk and whispered, which he totally understood. The wastrel whose only reputation was doing drugs and spending his whole life at the brothel was here, at this party. Honestly, Norton was dragging down the party's reputation just by stepping out of his carriage. Lily shrank back, clearly uncomfortable. Rhys took her hand and smiled at her. Come, they don't know yet that I've changed. Let's show them. As much as he hated people talking behind his back, he did have to admit that he was used to it. Sure, He hated it, and it made him feel gross all the way to his heart, but it had happened so much that he'd learned to push the feeling down. This level of talking behind his back wasn't going to bother him. It didn't hurt that he wasn't himself, but instead, Norton Tunk. Honestly, it kind of made the whole situation ridiculous. These people would all be whispering about poor Lily and what a good man Norton had been if they'd known he was dead, regardless of their actual opinions about him, but now, they were letting the truth slip out despite the man's dead status. Rhys felt the urge to blow his hair up big and hold his hands out in front of him in a vague grasping gesture. Society, he thought, but he thought it like the word, aliens. She looked up at him, then took a deep breath and nodded. All right. He looked at her, and the additional absurdity struck him, that she was nervous about this because they might laugh at her, while he was nervous about this because his life, and the life of many of his friends, were all at stake here. Everyone's got their troubles, he thought, and chuckled to himself. Lily frowned at him. What? Nothing. I'm just so excited to be here. You've been making strange noises this whole time. You didn't start taking something again, did you? She asked, squinting at him. I'm stone cold sober, Rhys assured her. He paused a beat, then glanced at her. I'm just weird. Oh. Lily glanced down, blushing. Why's she blushing? Normies are weird. Rhys offered her his hand. Shall we? Milady. Tips fedora, he added silently. And then, damn, I really am nervous. I only pull out the stale memes when I'm really anxious. I'll try to be more normal, Rhys assured her. She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. They strode toward the gardens, where servants in matching, neat robes and white gloves gestured them toward the house. Just beyond, a butler type stood in front of a small cadre of servants. He smiled at them. Good afternoon. Would you like to be guided toward the house, or would you like to experience the rose maze and gardens? Rhys smiled. The maze sounded annoying, and he already had enough moving pieces without adding on a fun maze to the front. Gway. Lily gripped his arm. Her eyes lit up, and she stared eagerly at the roses. He looked at her, then sighed. Well, it can't be too hard. It's meant to be enjoyable entertainment for nobles. We'll wander the rose garden, thanks. Excellent. Please, take this. He reached into his robe and pulled out a slender cylinder that looked, for all the world, like a flare. If you cannot find your way out after an hour, please light this, and an attendant will find you and lead you to the main hall in time for dinner. Or maybe it can be that hard, he thought, raising his brows a bit. Nonetheless, he accepted the flare. He didn't necessarily want to make his move before dinner. After dinner, when everyone was fat, fed, and lazy, and had successfully made it through most of the event with no negative occurrences, that was the time to make his move. And maybe he was regretting his choice a little, but then he looked at Lily, and he couldn't bring himself to ask to be guided. It really, truly, didn't matter that much to him, and Lily looked like she'd really enjoy it. He didn't want to ruin someone else's fun when he didn't even know if he'd be able to do his plan today anyways, since he didn't know for sure if Virgil was going to be at the ball. Usually, rose bushes wouldn't be dense enough to truly form a maze. Roses were sparse things, with lots of room between the thorned branches, or at least, the ones Rhys knew had been. These roses, though, were thick and dense, with tightly twined branches and big, fluffy flowers as big as his head. They oozed energy, almost pulsating with mana. The sheer density of energy in the roses was almost too much to comprehend. Lily bounced off ahead of him, eager to get moving through the maze. He followed Lily into the gardens, tucking the flare into his storage ring. The gardens were beautiful, to Lily's credit. Rhys paused, taking in a white rose with red stripes on its petals, and reflected that he really hadn't been taking time to stop and smell the roses lately. Soon, he promised himself. Soon, he'd have Bast and Straw freed, and Mouse back on his side, and then he could stop and smell the roses. For now, this would just have to be a temporary respite. A pause in the brief moment of calm before the storm. Ahead of him, Lily bounded along, pausing to take a close look at many of the bushes. She glanced back at him, then gestured him closer. Do you see this? This rose. Rhys obediently leaned in. It was a small rose with delicate vines flecked with razor-sharp thorns. The tightly curled flower spread blood-colored petals in the dying light, perfect and beautiful, yet somehow exuding a sinister aura. It's very pretty, he said, not sure what else to say. That rose is creeping me out seemed like a weird way to take the conversation, not to mention a buzzkill. She nodded. Look closer. Do you see how its leaves are more finely serrated than most roses? Almost like teeth. He leaned in. Now that she'd mentioned it, the edges of the rose did look almost like fangs. Yeah, I do. It's a blood-drinking rosé. You can tell by the bright color, but the leaves are the real hint. If one were to pluck this rose and throw it on an injured foe, it would drain the injured person dry. Rhys raised his brows. Oh. She caught his expression and smiled. But if you powder the petals and use it in a tincture, it can stop bleeding in even the most mortal of wounds. It's both a weapon and a cure. This is the path of the rose, to be both curse and cure at once. Rhys tilted his head. You seem to know a lot about this. I dreamed of being invited to the Trashy's Briar Heart School when I was a girl. I memorized all the flowers, learned all the techniques they shared with the world, even some they leaked out unintentionally, she said, her eyes gleaming with passion. And then her expression drooped, and the passion vanished. But then I grew up, and I realized it was impossible. Don't say impossible. You could still try and join, even today, Rhys said. No. For someone of my talents, it's impossible. It's simply beyond my reach. My role is as a housewife, and that's all. Don't say that. Didn't I show you? You have potential, just like everyone else. You might have to work harder to reach it, but that doesn't mean it isn't possible at all. If you work as hard as you can, I'm sure you could at least get accepted to the school and officially become a member of their cadre, Rhys said. She paused at that, looking up at him. After a moment, she shook her head. The things you can do, they aren't possible for everyone. If you aren't there, I struggle to make progress. I can't step forward on my own. Besides, I'm too old. The only thing keeping you from stepping forward is that defeatist attitude. Have you ever applied? Rhys asked. I was hoping to get invited. I wouldn't want to embarrass myself. Embarrass? Isn't this your dream? Isn't it what you've always wanted? A dream is worth embarrassing yourself for, wouldn't you agree? She looked down. Her cheeks flushed, but not with embarrassment, with frustration. You don't understand. I can't. Rhys crossed his arms. As long as you can say that with as much determination as you just did, then I agree. No, you can't. It's only when you abandon that defeatist attitude and actually try, regardless of how hard or embarrassing or whatever it is, that you can achieve the things you so desperately want to achieve. And don't tell me, I'm too old. We're mages. Who cares how old we are? Isn't it our goal to eternally keep learning and growing, to never stop moving forward? For some people, it is. But not for me. Why not? You have all your limbs, your senses, and your vigor, not to mention wealth and privilege. There are people who would kill to be in your position. Lily shot him a shocked look of realization at that. Not me. I'm here for other reasons. But that's not the point. The point is, there are people who would kill to be in your position. And what are you doing? You're telling me it's not possible. Have you ever tried? Or did you just give up before you started? I thought withdrawing quietly was the best for everyone. Withdrawing quietly. Sure, it's best for the school, because they don't have to look at your application, What if the school wants you? What if they desperately need students like you, and you're actually harming them by not applying? Don't let something as immaterial and worthless as expectations keep you from trying. Because the only thing more annoying than a defeatist, is someone who's never tried, telling someone who has tried, that what they've done is impossible, and thinking they, who have never tried, are the ones in the right, and not only that, but that they, having never tried, have the right to tell the one who's tried and succeeded that they are wrong and that what they know is truth, what they know is possible, cannot be possible. It was a gripe from his old world again, an old tiresome mental hang-up. Someone who'd never tried to do the things he'd done would tell him that it wasn't possible for him to have done them, and gloat and act righteous, as if they'd caught him out, even though he'd done whatever it was they were talking about. Usually, he just didn't have the energy to point out all the little details of how they were wrong, but walking away always left him with a bitter taste in his mouth. This conversation was no different. When he thought of himself, abandoned in the garbage patch, refusing to give up even if the world said it was impossible, and her, here at the top of the world, sniffling about how she could never become the mage she dreamed of being due to the mildest barrier, it really made him want to punt her right out of this rose garden. He held back since it wasn't the gentlemanly thing to do, and he was, after all, the reformed version of Norton Tunk, but man. It got right under his skin in the worst kind of way. She stomped, frustrated. You don't understand. They won't take me. They won't. So what? So what? Grow your own roses. Build your own techniques. No one's stopping you from doing that. Even if I don't understand this situation, even if you really are right that they won't accept you as a student, don't let that stop you. You can do it on your own. No one can stop you. That's not how this works. Maybe it worked that way for you, but making a start from a talentless place is a talent in of itself. Rhys spread his hands. If you're going to chalk everything up to talent, then there's nothing I can do for you. All you're doing is convincing yourself you can't do anything. If you spend your whole life making up excuses for why you can't accomplish anything, then yes, you won't accomplish anything. Stop making excuses and start working. He knew he sounded like those garbage cheap motivational speakers, you can do anything if you try. Stop making excuses, start working, but for the first time in his life, he'd run into someone who actually needed to hear that advice. It was crazy to encounter someone who really didn't think they could accomplish anything, who really could be helped by just being told, "You really can do it, idiot," the idiot, free of charge from Rhys himself. Of course, she didn't seem to be convinced, nor did Rhys think he'd done the best job of selling it, but damn, just running into that person was wild. He sighed and lifted his head, looking at the mansion. This isn't getting us anywhere. Shall we proceed? Lily took a deep breath, then nodded, all her frustration and irritation hidden behind a mask. We shall. Rhys wandered through the rose gardens after Lily, not interested in conversing with her much anymore, and nor did she initiate a conversation. She probably hated him after all that. And honestly, he wasn't the biggest fan of her, either. Getting told that what he'd done was impossible, then just hearing nothing but excuses nonstop, no wonder she hadn't been able to grow until now. Instead of scrambling for an answer, no matter what it was or how hard it was to accomplish, she'd just given up and found excuses instead. It was fine to live that way. There were things that everyone had to give up on, where it caused them so much pain to press on that the only answer was to make an excuse and bow out. And even if all she wanted to do was make excuses and laze away her whole life, he wouldn't have begrudged her that, either. But instead, making excuses, fixing them as absolutes in her mind, then developing a victim complex around the things she'd decided for herself, that was the part he couldn't forgive or get over. He snorted to himself, amused yet again. The better I know her, the less I like her. It wasn't the rom-com way, but then again, this wasn't a rom-com. This was his reality, like it or hate it, and the number of times things went in a not very rom-com way was far higher than the number of times they went in a rom-com way. That's probably for the best, honestly. Rhys lifted his hand up, a bit curious if anything kept him from flying directly to the mansion and abandoning the maze entirely. To his shock, there was actually a barrier between him and the sky. It wasn't the strongest barrier, and just from testing it, he sensed that he could overwhelm it even without relying on impurities, so he lowered his hand. If he needed to, he could get out. That was the important part. Until then, he'd go along with these mage nobles' weird habit of pretending to be mortal, and keep wandering the maze with Lily. They turned the corner and abruptly came upon a mage couple making out in a dead end. Rhys and Lily alike quickly took another turn, leaving the couple to their business. Rhys reached out as they turned the next corner, trying to sense the couple's aura behind him, only to find that the roses soaked up his mana senses. He raised his brows. Mage nobles sure do go hard on playing the mortal. Even going so hard as to give us the awkward experience of walking in on another couple making out, huh? I didn't really need that, but I guess it's a novel experience for mage nobles, who've only been mages their whole life. Either that, or this Trashy lady that Lily idolizes is secretly an exhibitionist. Nothing wrong with that, I guess, but, you know, consent is key, and all. Ask someone before you put them directly in the non-concuck chair. It was also a warning to not do anything too strange or aggressive in the rose garden, since he literally didn't know what would be around the next corner. He was completely blinded. He hadn't noticed until now for two reasons. 1. He hadn't been actively paying attention to his mana senses, and 2. The roses ate away at it gently and quietly, so that he didn't feel like his mana senses were cut off. It felt like they reached their natural limit and eroded away the way they usually did, except their natural limit was far shorter than he was used to. He'd been frog slowly brought to a boiled, crab potted. Good thing I wasn't planning on doing anything drastic in the rose gardens, he thought sarcastically to himself, glancing at the couple over his shoulder. Shaking his head, he followed Lily around the next corner, and stopped dead. Classic white robes, long black hair, a black hilted sword at his side, brutal in its simplicity. The sword saint stood around the next bend, admiring a rose, or more literally, staring blankly at the nearest rose bush with the kind of vacant stare that told Rhys he wasn't seeing anything at all. Rhys. And stepping out from beside him was a very familiar figure, if he did look more haggard and wan than usual, Bast. Their eyes met. Rhys quashed as much of his mana signature as he could, though he knew he wouldn't be able to fully disguise it. He was already using his trash star instead of his mana core, but Bast recognized him anyways. There was nothing more he could do but emit as little of it as possible and hope Lily covered it up, or that Bast had enough compulsion wiggle room to cover for him, or at least pretend to doubt himself. As for his part, he was going to give Bast as much room as possible to doubt what he sensed, and bluff like hell. He pulled himself up to his full height and cleared his throat, then bowed low. So good to meet you, Sword Saint and Apprentice. It's an honor. He honestly wasn't sure how to formally address Bast, since he'd never done it, so all he could do was awkwardly refer to the Sword Saint's apprentice and hope it was close enough. Bast blinked. He looked Rhys up and down, then frowned. Rhys felt his mana senses test his, and shied back behind Lily to let her absorb as much of his probe as she could. Bast frowned, then nodded. My apologies. I made a mistake. Of course. No offense taken, I assure you. It made it easier on Rhys, too. He didn't have to run off and go find Bast and the Sword Saint in the middle of the night. Madame Tunk had assured him they'd be here, and he'd had no reason to doubt her, but it was reassuring to have found them this early. Though, for the sake of his stealth, he'd rather not have encountered them this early. I could always act now. Kick everything off from here, instead of my planned entry point. He considered it for a second, but then dismissed it. He still didn't have his proof for the Mage Nobles, and if he went for the Sword Saint before he went for that, he'd have very loudly kicked everything off without gaining the one thing he kind of needed things to be quiet for. Besides, there was more than one thing at stake on things remaining quiet for just a little while longer. Thus, nodding at Lily to follow, he walked past Bast and the Sword Saint and headed on through the Rose Maze. Now wasn't the time. His plan might be trash, but it was his plan, damn it, and he was going to stick with it. Now wasn't the time for ad-libbing. Sure, it was ad-libbing that had kicked off World War I, but ad-libbing, notably, had also gotten all the conspirators very jailed and even more executed, so this time, he was going to learn from history and keep himself unjailed and unexecuted, and not ad-lib. It was more important to him that everyone survived this, himself very much included, than that he succeeded in his goal of defeating or otherwise destroying Virgil. If he got everyone out of this alive, but Virgil also survived, he'd be much happier than if everyone died, Virgil included. He glanced back as they turned the corner and caught Bast looking at him over his shoulder. Their eyes met, and Bast looked away. Rhys turned away as well, pretending it was just a coincidence. I'm not sure he's fully convinced, but he's at least confused. Hopefully he isn't compelled to tell Virgil everything he suspects or thinks, so that if he's compelled to tell everything he knows, maybe he can have a little wiggle room with the confusion. And even if he can't wiggle out of telling Virgil about our encounter, he can at least truthfully say that he didn't know that it was me for sure, he just had a suspicion. It wasn't foolproof, and it meant his disguise was basically busted. But the thing was, he was making his move tonight. His disguise wasn't busted in a time frame that mattered for tonight. By the time Virgil asked Bast if he'd seen anyone, and Bast had communicated his experience, and Virgil had to decide if it was actually Rhys or not, Rhys was planning to have already made his move. And if he didn't make his move tonight, then he could simply scrap his face and start over. It was a bit annoying, and it meant Virgil would have an idea of where his attack was coming from and be suspicious of the Mage Nobles from now on, but that was kind of a bonus in of itself. If Virgil became even more paranoid and started pushing his less devoted followers away, that was a benefit for him, even if it meant it was harder for him to make his personal move. After all, he was effectively fighting the entire alliance right now, but he would benefit greatly if the alliance started to break up. Rhys sighed. I've really got to stop pitting myself against nation-states. Lily looked at him. Why didn't we stay and talk more with the Sword Saint? He was busy. He had more important things to do than talk to us, Rhys replied, knowing it wasn't the best excuse. Like, smell the roses. The most important thing you can do, in fact. Never forget to stop and smell the roses, my apprentice. She stared at him. I'm your apprentice. No. Apprentices are commitment. They're like slightly less shitty children. No, you're my wife. Which isn't commitment. Not the way kids are, Rhys muttered under his breath. Between kids and marriage, kids terrified him, and marriage was just a minor inconvenience. He wasn't really sure why. But married people suddenly stopped being interested in anything he cared about and spent all their time watching reality TV and soap operas, and that part did terrify him a little, but he had faith in his stubborn refusal to give up on anime and all other forms of shit entertainment, so he wasn't going to let that stop him from finally acquiring sex, or whatever it was that married people did with one another. Have long conversations about budgets and taxes. As someone who was dimly acquainted with how sex worked in the first place, he wasn't really sure what he was missing, or what the point was, but he knew that a lot of people seemed to think it was very important. Marriage, that was, not necessarily sex. His vague understanding of the situation went like this: no sex until marriage, and then once you got marriage, no more sex because you were married, or something. It seemed like the rule was just, no sex, to him, but maybe there was some moment he was forgetting. Like the very moment they got married, though he'd never seen any freaky business on the altar, bar the time his semi-alcoholic second cousin had sucked very enthusiastic face with her husband for so long that his parents got uncomfortable. Rhys snorted. Well, that's the way sex and marriage were presented in sitcoms and rom-coms, anyways, which probably isn't the best way to learn how they work. The really trashy thing would be to build a harem, but given his negative Rhys, he didn't think that was going to happen anytime soon. Besides, he was pretty sure he didn't want that kind of stress in his life. Playing mild interest/neutral party for Lyra, Mouse, and Sable was hard enough. He didn't want to commit to that kind of stressful relationship for the rest of his life. Unaware of Rhys's internal monologue, Lily straightened up, stiffening her back. I think it's a commitment. I'm sure it is, Rhys agreed. Not his fake relationship with Lily, but real marriage was probably a commitment. Lily looked at him, then harumphed and stormed ahead a few steps. Rhys stared after her, confused as to where he'd fucked up this time. They didn't understand each other, so it wasn't hard to miscommunicate. She knew he was fake, so was she under the impression that he was actually here to become her new husband? Give me the confidence of a white man, Mage Noble style, Rhys thought, shaking his head at her back. What the hell would he accomplish by stealing Tunk's wife? Sex, a little voice whispered in the back of his mind, but he dismissed it. Lily wasn't his type, also, that was disgusting, also, there was no way that was what she wanted from him. That was some hentai-ass plot bullshit, where the wife of the replaced husband actually did want him desperately because she had no brain cells, or whatever hentai needed that particular moment for her to be interested in the male character, and he was 100% sure that real life didn't work like hentai. Sure, some guys thought it did, but he wasn't that trashy. If he had to be honest, she was probably just after his riches/the benefits of living with a tier 4 mage. And he had taken her husband's place, so it wasn't the wildest thing to guess that his objective might be Lily. He'd have thought she might have figured out that he was not here for Lily yet, but who knew? There were plenty of trashy female-oriented romances where the male lead swept into the woman's life, then behaved like a perfect gentleman so she'd fall for him or something. They often didn't have well-defined personalities or goals, then finally had bodice-ripping sex with her after she melted for him. He didn't live in that kind of delusory world, but who knew? Maybe Lily did. She was lonely, after all, with an abusive/neglectful husband, aka the exact demographic targeted by bodice rippers. The exit to the rose maze loomed. Lily rushed out, eager to escape him. Rhys followed behind her, eager to see if Virgil was, in fact, at this ball. At this point, he was pretty committed. Locked in. In other words, I'll be real mildly inconvenienced if I have to teleport out and come back later. They entered the ballroom. Lily immediately abandoned him to go chat with some other girls, and Rhys was happy to let her go. They wouldn't be debuting as the new happy couple, but that was okay. If everyone thought things were status quo, and Lily had just managed to somehow drag her shitty addict husband to the ball, then he was far more likely to be able to move around without anyone noticing too much. Though, even as he thought it, he couldn't help but notice all the mage nobles stealing glances his way. He twisted his nose, slightly annoyed. Hey, I know, I haven't been to a ball in a while, but surely it's not that exciting. Then again, these guys were the popular kids, the society. There was nothing popular kids liked more than drama, and he'd gone and provided them all with a delicious twist. Rhys sighed, running a hand through his hair. No, that's on me. That's my bad. I should have seen this coming. It was so obvious that people would take interest in Norton's sudden return to society. It was the opening shot in endless period dramas and romances, for the male lead to suddenly return to society after a long, mysterious, unexplained absence. And what had he done, if not exactly that? He retreated to the wall and leaned against it, browsing the crowd in silence. If they were going to be interested in him, then the only thing he could do was to be very, very boring, and hope they lost interest before too long. Fortunately, Tunk was married and therefore not a promising suitor, an important aspect of all those suddenly returning mysterious male leads, so there was still hope that they'd overlook him after a little while. Lily happily chatted with her friends across the way. The longer she spent away from him, the happier she looked. It was fair enough. He didn't like her, and evidently, the feeling was mutual. Sometimes, people were just incompatible, and there was nothing anyone could do about that. At this point, he was just waiting for Virgil to show up. He kept his mana senses extended, scanning the room non-stop, but didn't sense anyone but the random mage nobles he saw. None of them stood out to him, nor did any of them seem particularly associated with Virgil, but the room was relatively low tier right now. Aside from him, no one pushed beyond mid-tier 2, and he was suppressing his power to just about the same level. Virgil didn't seem like the type to hang with low-level dudes, so if he was going to make an appearance, it wouldn't be until the ball was well and truly going, not now, when there were just a few lonely weak mages milling about pointlessly. If this was a celebrity ball, then he was currently hanging out with the kind of D and F list celebrities who wouldn't make the cut on the fashion lineup even if they walked the carpet wearing the most extreme, most political, most outrageous gown possible. Virgil, on the other hand, was the kind of A-list guy who'd appear in the photo lineup even if he showed up in a department store suit. He wouldn't deserve it, but he'd be there anyways, like the waste of space he was. That had always pissed him off, honestly. He wasn't enough of a celebrity chaser to actually go looking for celebrity pics, so he just got whatever the news outlets put on their front pages, and that meant he usually got the crème de la crème of celebrity pics. When that was very beautiful women in fantastic and sometimes revealing gowns, that was amazing. When it was dudes in inventive and fresh outfits, playing with colors and textures, that was also fine. When it was some white dude-ass dude in a white dude-ass tuxedo that he could have rented at the local downtown prom store, except it probably cost thousands for no reason since it looked the same as every other tuxedo, that was decidedly, markedly, not fine. If he wanted to see dudes in tuxedos, he would have gone to prom. He wanted to see hot people in cool, haute couture, borderline cosplay gear, not boring old men in generic suits. The ballroom slowly filled. Rhys pushed off the wall and wandered the ball, dropping tiny hoops of trash as he walked. He anticipated a high quantity of short jumps in his future, and where better to teleport than a target-rich environment where Virgil would be afraid to launch his big attacks, or better yet, where he would launch big attacks despite all the mage nobles around, and consequently piss off a lot of mage nobles. It wasn't good behavior on Rhys's part, honestly. It might qualify as a war crime, but it was strategy. A trashy person like him could disregard good behavior for the sake of good strategy. He peered around, then wandered off into the back halls and added a few back there as well, just so he had options. He also had the ones he'd scattered all over the town, and the ones distributed around the world as well, but they were less relevant to the impending final battle, with one very important exception. Even though he could freely flee, he wasn't interested in doing so. This was the time. The final confrontation with Virgil and the Alliance. He didn't intend to back down. Unless he really underestimated the Alliance's devotion to Virgil and Virgil's personal power. In that case, then all those hoops scattered over the world were a nice backup plan that he'd definitely set up deliberately beforehand so he could flee. Burning to death. Warp out. Falling to your doom. Warp out. The final boss is about to OHKO you. Just warp out. Virgil wasn't a giant pig monster and no one was taking wild breaths, but it was the same idea. It wasn't plan A, but it was always good to have plan Bs. Especially when having unprotected good times. Focus, Rhys. Let's lock in and get the job done. You're bouncing off the walls mentally because you're nervous. Slow down. Think. He paused. Or maybe don't think. Too much thinking. Think less. Ooga booga. Excuse me, sir. Are you looking for something? Rhys looked up. A servant stood before him, a slightly confused expression on his face. He rubbed his nose. No, just, Needed a moment away from it all. The servant gave him a skeptical look. Could I show you back to the ballroom? Sure, why not? He was currently wearing the face of a guy who had previously had a reputation for sneaking off during parties and having a very good time all alone with some party dust, so it made nothing but sense that he was on the "shepherd them back" list. And that assumed that anyone was allowed to wander the mansion. Given how much valuable stuff was in here, he would only be surprised if people were given free rein of the place. The servant bowed and gestured for Rhys to follow him. Rhys fell in line, out of boredom more than anything. He'd already seeded plenty of plan Bs, so he was good to go. Besides, things should be heating up by now. He could hear the sound of conversation from here, and there was now a low, quiet hum of music to accompany the conversation. The ball was getting started. Not yet in full swing, but it was getting started enough for him to start to take account of the power level of the ball, instead of it only being the losers and weaklings who had to show up early to get any attention. He stepped back onto the ballroom floor, and was shocked at the escalation of power. A blast of Tier 3 and borderline 4 power rushed at him the second he arrived. Rhys checked his suppressed trash core, just to be sure, but it was still around Tier 2 to low Tier 3, about where Norton Tunk's power was, or could conceivably have reached in the time since he died. A moment later, the power retreated a hair as he felt dozens of mana senses withdraw from him, but they remained close, ever pressing at the edges of his attention. Sweat dripped down his back, and he wiped his brow. Phew. So this is the mage noble's might. Alone, they didn't amount to much. Together, they were a force to behold. And this wasn't even the full might of the nobles. More still entered the room even as he watched, growing stronger and stronger as the time ticked down to the formal start of the ball. If he had to fight them all, he didn't like his chances. Right, which is why I have the plan. It's why there's an order to my operations. If we were just multiplying and adding willy-nilly, we wouldn't get any math done. If we just grab Bast without handling the mob, I'll die by the mob. Order of operations. He breathed out, once more resolved in his decision to stick to the plan rather than wing it. Sometimes, he had to do the less trashy thing in the moment so he could do more trashy things in the future. It was an unfortunate truth of his life that he couldn't always take the easy trash out when he had a hard trash on the way. Or, however he should actually phrase that. He had the feeling things had kind of slipped away from him there. Once the pressure of everyone's attention slipped off of him, he stealthily scanned the room once more, both visually and with his mana senses, but Virgil still wasn't in attendance. He scowled. Come on, Virgil. This is one of the biggest balls of the season. Madame Tunk herself picked it before she knew of my evil objectives. Well, she still doesn't know exactly what they are. But she knows I have evil objectives and wanted to mingle with Virgil. A thought flashed through his mind. Surely she wouldn't have interrupted his chances of meeting Virgil here, right? She didn't seem super into Virgil, since she'd carefully stated her neutrality and all, but she did also value stability. Had she gone to Virgil and told him, well, no. If she'd told him, with Virgil's over-the-top paranoia, there was no chance that Rhys would be allowed to stay within the capital, let alone walk into the ball. At worst, she'd gone to Virgil and gently nudged for him to not attend the ball. There's no way she did that, though, right? She wants to be on my good side, and she knows how strong I am. She isn't going to risk her life, or anything too crazy. Besides, with as paranoid as Virgil is, just mentioning that I'm here, let alone hiding out with her daughter-in-law, might be enough to get her imprisoned and killed. She's smart enough to understand that, and if she went to him and a conflict broke out, with the power levels involved, there's no way I wouldn't know about it, no way the whole city wouldn't know about it. Deep breaths. Focus. He just hasn't showed up yet. No one's betrayed you, he's just taking his sweet time. He's being fashionably late, and I'm freaking out over nothing. At the far end of the ballroom from the double doors where the more important couples were being announced to the room, plush rose-colored curtains drew open. For the first time since he was a child, and he and Bast were separated from straw, he laid eyes upon Trashy. She looked just as she had when he was a child, if his eyes were somewhat less blinded now by the beauty of a high-rank mage. Today, she wore her hair in a long braid that hung over her shoulder, and was dressed in a tight-fitting strapless crimson gown that blossomed into a rose around her chest. Even so, she still carried her whip at her hip, in typical mage fashion. She could have put it in her storage ring and still been armed, but she, and most mages, including mage nobles, preferred to wear their weapons openly. I guess maybe, there's someone out there who can shut down storage rings, or something. Or they're worried about the split second it would take to draw their weapon from their ring. Or, it's just a giant dick measuring contest, and everyone wants the world to know that they have the biggest sword. Rhys shrugged. It didn't really matter, it was just one of those strange things that society would do. Ilya spread her hands, displaying her rose-red nails, and smiled at her attendees. Welcome to the annual Rose Gala. I hope everyone has a marvelous time tonight. Thank you for. Rhys tuned out. He turned toward the door, waiting. They'd finally hit the time of, fashionably late, which, if his instincts were right, meant Virgil should be appearing at any moment now. Ilya's speech wound on. As it drew to a close, a trio quietly entered through the double doors. Though they entered discreetly, a hush instantly fell over the crowd, and all eyes shifted from the climax of Ilya's speech to the entrance. Rhys stood off the wall. He stared along with everyone else, his breath catching in his throat. There he was. At long last, flanked by the Sword Saint and his apprentice, the man of the hour, Virgil. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.